Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. The amber glow of dashboard lights cast long shadows across Marcus's Chen's weathered face as his 18-wheeler hummed steadily down the empty interstate. The digital clock read to 47 a.m., and the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt had become a hypnotic lullaby that threatened to pull his eyelids closed. He'd been driving for Consolidated Freight for nearly 15 years, and these overnight runs from Phoenix to Denver had become as familiar as breathing. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices offering companionship in the vast loneliness of the American highway system. Tonight felt different somehow, though Marcus couldn't quite pinpoint why. The usual constellation of truck stop lights and billboards seemed dimmer, as if the darkness between them had grown thicker and more oppressive. His cargo manifest listed standard electronics equipment bound for a Best Buy distribution center. Nothing unusual or particularly valuable. The load was properly secured, his logbook was current, and his truck had passed inspection just 3 days prior. Everything was routine, professional, exactly as it should be. The first sign that something was amiss came when his GPS began displaying impossible information. According to the satellite navigation system, he was simultaneously traveling north on Interstate 25 and south on Interstate 17, while also somehow being stationary in a truck stop in Flagstaff that he'd passed hours ago. Marcus tapped the screen with his index finger, hoping to clear what was obviously a technical glitch, but the conflicting readings persisted. He'd learned to trust technology over the years, but decades of driving had also taught him to rely on his own instincts and knowledge of the roads. As he crested a hill that should have offered a panoramic view of the valley below, Marcus instead found himself staring into an impenetrable wall of fog that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The mist appeared suddenly, without the gradual thickening that usually accompanied weather changes in the desert. One moment he could see the familiar silhouettes of distant mountains against the star-filled sky, and the next moment visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. His headlights, normally powerful enough to illuminate the road far ahead, now created only a weak cone of yellow light that was quickly swallowed by the supernatural-looking haze. Marcus downshifted and reduced his speed to a cautious crawl, his hands gripping the steering wheel with increasing tension. The fog seemed to press against his windshield like something alive and curious, forming patterns that almost resembled faces before dissolving back into shapeless vapor. His truck's powerful diesel engine, which had never failed him in all his years of driving, began to emit an irregular rhythm, occasionally missing a beat, as if something was interfering with its normally reliable combustion cycle. The temperature gauge remained normal, and all other indicators showed green, but the engine's behavior was definitely abnormal. The CB radio, which had been providing its usual mix of traffic updates and casual conversation, suddenly filled with voices speaking in languages Marcus didn't recognize. The words had an ancient quality to them, syllables that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his chest cavity. Some voices sounded urgent, others plaintive, and a few carried what could only be described as warning tones. He tried changing channels, but every frequency carried the same mysterious multilingual chorus. When he attempted to transmit his own location and request assistance, his microphone produced only static, as if his words were being absorbed by the surrounding fog before they could reach the airwaves. The road beneath his wheels began to change texture in ways that defied explanation. What had been smooth asphalt moments before now felt rough and uneven, causing his trailer to bounce and sway despite his reduced speed. Through his side mirrors, Marcus caught glimpses of landscape that bore no resemblance to the Arizona desert he'd been traveling through for hours. Instead of cacti and rocky outcroppings, he saw what appeared to be ancient ruins, their weathered stone blocks partially hidden by twisted trees that looked as if they'd been growing for centuries in soil that shouldn't exist in this arid climate. His fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full just minutes earlier, now registered nearly empty despite the impossibility of such rapid consumption. The mathematical certainty of diesel fuel economy, something Marcus had calculated thousands of times over his career, no longer applied to his current situation. His truck should have been capable of traveling at least 400 more miles on the remaining fuel, but the needle continued its impossible descent toward empty with each passing minute. As the fog began to thin slightly, Marcus realized he was no longer traveling on a divided interstate highway. Instead, his truck was following what appeared to be a single-lane dirt road that wound through a landscape of twisted metal sculptures that might once have been other vehicles. In the dim glow of his headlights, he could make out the rusted remains of cars, trucks, and motorcycles, arranged in patterns that suggested some form of deliberate placement rather than random abandonment. The metal formed spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if the angles themselves were somehow wrong and offensive to human perception. The realization that he needed to turn around came with crystal clarity. But when Marcus looked for a place to safely maneuver his 40-foot trailer, he discovered that the road behind him had vanished entirely, where moments before there had been a clear path through the fog. Now there was only an impenetrable wall of darkness that his headlights couldn't penetrate. His truck had somehow become trapped on a road that existed in defiance of geography, physics, and common sense, carrying him steadily toward a destination that wasn't marked on any map he'd ever studied in his years of professional driving across the American landscape. Let's dive into the next story. Betty Rodriguez had been driving commercial vehicles for 23 years, and in all that time, she'd never encountered a way station quite like the one that appeared in her headlights on this particular Tuesday morning. The sign looked official enough, with the standard Department of Transportation logo and the familiar all commercial vehicles must stop directive, but something about its placement felt wrong. According to her route planning software and every map she'd consulted, there shouldn't be any way stations on this stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada for at least another 120 miles. The facility itself appeared modern and well-maintained, with freshly painted lines marking the approach lanes and electronic signs that displayed the current time and temperature. Solar panels gleamed on the roof of the inspection building, and the scale platforms looked new, their digital displays showing precise weight readings in bright green numbers. Everything about the station suggested efficiency and official authority, yet Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was amiss with the entire setup. As her Peterbilt rumbled onto the first scale platform, the weight displayed seemed reasonable for her load of canned goods, destined for grocery stores in Reno. The inspector who emerged from the building wore a proper uniform with all the correct badges and insignia, his clipboard held at the regulation angle, his manner professional but not unfriendly. He requested her logbook, commercial driver's license, and shipping manifest with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these inspections thousands of times before. What troubled Betty was the inspector's complete lack of response to her questions about the station's location. When she mentioned that her GPS hadn't shown this facility, he simply nodded and continued his paperwork. When she asked about the station's designation number, which should have been clearly posted according to federal regulations, he gave her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and mumbled something about recent administrative changes. The inspection process stretched on far longer than normal, with the official taking detailed photographs, not just of her truck and trailer, but of Betty herself from multiple angles. He measured distances between various components of her vehicle with instruments that looked more like surveying equipment than standard Department of Transportation tools. When he asked her to step into the inspection building to complete additional paperwork, Betty noticed that the interior contained computers and monitoring equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for a routine commercial vehicle inspection facility. The building's interior walls were lined with screens displaying what appeared to be live feeds from cameras positioned at various points along the highway system. Betty could see other trucks approaching from different directions, their drivers unaware that they were being observed and tracked from this remote location. The inspector's desk contained files on dozens of commercial drivers, complete with detailed personal information that went far beyond what would normally be available to way station personnel. Her own file was surprisingly thick, containing photographs and documents spanning her entire driving career. When Betty asked to use the restroom, she was directed down a hallway that seemed to extend much farther into the building than the exterior dimensions would suggest possible. The walls were lined with doors marked with numbers and letters that followed no logical sequence, and from behind, several of them came sounds that definitely didn't belong in a government inspection facility. She heard what sounded like machinery operating, voices speaking in urgent whispers, and an occasional electronic beeping that reminded her of hospital monitoring equipment. The restroom itself appeared normal at first glance, but the mirror above the sink showed a reflection that was subtly wrong. Betty's image appeared slightly delayed, as if the glass was showing her movements from several seconds in the past. When she raised her hand, her reflection took a moment to catch up, and when she turned her head, the mirrored Betty continued looking straight ahead for a heartbeat too long. The fluorescent lighting flickered in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, like some form of coded communication. Returning to the main office, Betty found the inspector studying her logbook with unusual intensity, running his finger along her route entries and making notes in margins that hadn't been there before, and her family relationships that had no bearing on commercial vehicle safety or regulatory compliance. When she pressed him for an explanation of these inquiries, he explained that they were part of a new federal initiative to ensure driver wellness and security, though he couldn't provide any documentation of such a program. The final stage of the inspection involved connecting diagnostic equipment to her truck's electronic systems. The inspector plugged cables into ports that Betty was certain hadn't existed on her dashboard when she'd started her trip that morning. The equipment began displaying data streams that scrolled too quickly for her to read, but she caught glimpses of information that seemed to include her heart rate, her emotional state, and other biometric data that her truck's standard systems shouldn't have been capable of monitoring. As the inspection concluded and Betty was cleared to continue her journey, she noticed other trucks in the distance that appeared to be approaching the way station. However, when she looked back in her mirrors after pulling onto the highway, the facility had completely vanished. The roadside showed only empty desert, with no evidence that a way station had ever existed in that location. Her logbook, which the inspector had stamped and returned, now contained an entry written in handwriting that wasn't hers, documenting an inspection at a facility that, according to every official record she could access, simply didn't exist. Let's dive into the next story. James Mitchell received the assignment through the usual channels. A text message to his company phone at 3 in the morning with pickup and delivery details that seemed straightforward enough. The load was waiting at a warehouse in Bakersfield, California, and needed to be delivered to a distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee, within 72 hours. The pay was better than average for a cross-country haul, though not so exceptional as to raise immediate suspicions. James had been an owner-operator for 12 years, and he'd learned that sometimes good-paying loads came available at odd hours when other drivers weren't immediately available to accept them. The warehouse district in Bakersfield was familiar territory, a maze of industrial buildings and loading docks that James had navigated dozens of times over the years. However, the address on his pickup sheet led him to a facility he'd never noticed before, despite having delivered 2 neighboring warehouses on multiple occasions. The building appeared older than its surroundings, constructed of weathered brick and concrete that suggested it had been built decades before the modern distribution centers that dominated the area. The loading dock was staffed by workers who moved with unusual efficiency, their actions coordinated in ways that suggested long practice with specific procedures. They wore standard warehouse uniforms, but something about their demeanor felt distinctly professional, almost military in its precision. The cargo itself consisted of uniformly sized wooden crates, each one measuring approximately 4 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet, secured with metal bands and bearing shipping labels that contained only numerical codes rather than descriptive text. James inspected the load, as required by DOT regulations, checking that the weight distribution was appropriate for safe transport and that all cargo was properly secured. The crates were heavier than their size would suggest, and when he tapped on the wood with his knuckles, they produced a solid sound that indicated they were completely filled rather than containing loose items that might shift during transport. The manifest listed the contents as industrial components, which was vague but not unusual for manufactured goods moving between facilities. The first unusual occurrence happened approximately 6 hours into the trip. As James was crossing through Arizona on Interstate 40, he stopped at a truck stop near Flagstaff for fuel and a mandatory rest break, following all federal hours of service regulations. When he returned to his trailer after a 30-minute break, he noticed that the arrangement of the crates had subtly changed. The wooden boxes were still properly secured and hadn't moved from their original positions, but somehow they appeared to be stacked in a different configuration than he remembered from the loading process. James carefully documented the cargo arrangement with his phone camera. The images confirmed that the crates were indeed in different positions, despite being held in place by tie-downs and load bars that showed no signs of having been disturbed. The metal securing straps still showed the same tension settings, and the load bars remained properly adjusted, yet somehow the cargo had rearranged itself during his brief absence from the vehicle. As night fell and James continued eastward through New Mexico, he began hearing sounds from the trailer that couldn't be explained by normal road vibration or cargo settling. The noises were rhythmic and deliberate, like someone methodically working with tools inside the enclosed space. When he pulled over at the next available truck stop to investigate, he found the trailer doors still properly sealed, with the security device installed at the point of origin. The sounds stopped the moment he approached the back of the trailer, replaced by a silence that felt somehow expectant and watchful. The CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed to be discussing his specific load, though the voices used codes and terminology he didn't recognize. References to Package 17 and Memphis Protocol suggested that other parties were tracking his progress across the country. When James attempted to participate in these conversations, asking for clarification about the coded language, the transmissions immediately stopped, leaving only static on all channels until he was several miles down the road. His GPS system began displaying route suggestions that deviated from the most direct path to Memphis, recommending detours through small towns and secondary highways that would add unnecessary miles and time to the delivery. When James ignored these suggestions and continued on the interstate system, the device began showing his location incorrectly, placing him on roads he wasn't actually traveling and calculating arrival times that made no mathematical sense given his actual speed and distance remaining. The sleeping berth in James's truck had always been a comfortable refuge during mandatory rest periods, but on this particular trip, sleep became increasingly elusive. Every time he began to drift off, he would hear what sounded like whispered conversations coming from the direction of his trailer. The voices were too indistinct to understand, but their tone suggested urgency and planning. When he used a flashlight to check the exterior of his trailer, he found no evidence of anyone else in the vicinity, yet the sounds continued whenever he returned to his bunk. Electronic devices began malfunctioning in ways that defied troubleshooting. His cell phone's battery would drain completely within hours, despite showing full charge, and when connected to the truck's charging system, it would display error messages about incompatible power sources. His satellite radio lost signal consistently, even in areas with clear sky visibility where reception should have been perfect. The truck's own electronic systems began displaying warning lights for components that tested perfectly normal when checked with diagnostic equipment. By the time James reached Oklahoma, he had begun to suspect that his cargo was something other than standard industrial components. The weight of the trailer seemed to be increasing gradually, requiring more power to maintain highway speeds on level ground. His fuel consumption had increased significantly beyond what could be explained by headwinds or route changes, suggesting that the load was somehow becoming more massive as the journey progressed toward its destination. The final night of the trip brought the most disturbing developments. As James drove through Arkansas in the early morning hours, approaching the Memphis delivery point, he noticed that his trailer was casting multiple shadows under the highway lighting, as if the cargo inside was somehow projecting its own illumination. The shadows moved independently of the truck's motion, writhing and stretching in patterns that hurt to observe directly. When other vehicles passed him on the highway, their drivers stared with expressions of confusion and concern, as if they too could perceive that something was fundamentally wrong with his load. The delivery address in Memphis led James to a facility that looked nothing like the distribution center described in his original assignment. Instead, he found himself backing up to a loading dock that belonged to what appeared to be a research facility, complete with security personnel and equipment that seemed designed for handling materials that required special precautions. As the wooden crates were unloaded, James caught a glimpse of contents that definitely weren't industrial components, though what he saw made so little sense that he questioned whether his eyes were playing tricks on him after 3 days of increasingly strange experiences. Let's dive into the next story. Carol Thompson had always appreciated the companionship that CB radio provided during long-haul trips across the Midwest. The familiar voices of other drivers created a sense of community that helped combat the isolation of spending weeks on the road, away from family and friends. Her handle was Prairie Rose, a name she'd chosen when she first started driving 15 years ago, and she'd built friendships with dozens of other drivers who shared the same routes and schedules. The informal network of truckers who communicated across the airwaves had become like an extended family, offering everything from traffic updates to emotional support during difficult times. On this particular run from Minneapolis to Kansas City, Carol was hauling a load of agricultural equipment that required careful handling due to its size and weight distribution. The route took her through rural areas of Iowa and Missouri, where CB radio was often the most reliable form of communication, especially during weather events that could affect driving conditions. She'd been monitoring Channel 19, the unofficial truckers' channel, listening to the usual mix of road reports, jokes, and casual conversation that made the miles pass more quickly. The first sign that something was different came when she began hearing voices discussing events that had happened decades in the past. A driver with the handle Iron Horse was describing road conditions for a snowstorm that had occurred in the winter of 1987, speaking as if it were happening in real time. Another voice, calling himself Roadmaster, was providing updates about construction projects that Carol remembered from her early days of driving, long completed work that had been finished more than a decade ago. At first, Carol assumed she was picking up some kind of recorded transmission, perhaps a nostalgic program being broadcast by one of the truckers as entertainment. However, when she attempted to join the conversation and ask about current conditions, the historical voices responded directly to her questions, addressing her by her handle and providing detailed information about routes and stops that perfectly matched her current location and travel plans. They seemed to know exactly where she was and where she was heading, despite discussing events from years in the past. The conversations became increasingly specific to Carol's own experiences as a driver. Iron Horse began reminiscing about loads she had hauled years earlier, describing cargo and delivery locations with perfect accuracy. Roadmaster mentioned truck stops where she had taken rest breaks, including details about meals she had eaten and people she had met that no one else could possibly have known. The voices spoke about these past events as if they were contemporary occurrences, creating a temporal confusion that made Carol question her own memories and perceptions. As evening approached and Carol continued south through Missouri, the CB chatter began including voices she recognized from drivers who had died in accidents over the years. Silverbird, a woman trucker who had been killed in a collision during an ice storm 5 years earlier, was discussing weather conditions and offering warnings about dangerous road conditions. Thunder Road, a driver who had suffered a fatal heart attack at a truck stop in Oklahoma, was providing updates about his delivery schedule and asking about the availability of parking spaces at various facilities. The deceased drivers spoke with the same familiarity and warmth that Carol remembered from when they were alive. sharing jokes and stories as if no time had passed since their last conversations. They asked about mutual friends and commented on changes in the trucking industry, discussing new regulations and technology developments that had occurred after their deaths. When Carol attempted to remind them that they were no longer among the living, they responded with confusion and gentle laughter, insisting that they were simply taking a different route but would catch up with her soon. The radio began picking up transmissions from different time periods simultaneously, creating overlapping conversations that spanned decades of trucking history. Drivers from the 1970s discussed fuel shortages and new CB equipment, while voices from the 1990s debated the merits of electronic logging devices that wouldn't be introduced for another 20 years. Carol found herself participating in multiple temporal conversations at once, her own voice somehow reaching across time to connect with drivers from different eras of the industry. Her truck's CB radio, which had been professionally installed and maintained, began displaying impossible signal strength readings and picking up transmissions on frequencies that weren't normally used for citizens band communications. The device showed incoming signals from locations that were hundreds of miles beyond the normal range of CB radio, and from some coordinates that didn't correspond to any actual geographic locations. When Carol attempted to contact other drivers using conventional channels, her transmissions seemed to be routed through the temporal network, reaching the intended recipients at different points in their past or future. The phenomenon intensified as Carol approached Kansas City, with the voices becoming more urgent in their attempts to communicate important information about her journey. They provided warnings about accidents that hadn't happened yet, road closures that weren't scheduled, and weather conditions that contradicted all current forecasts. The temporal drivers seemed to have access to information from multiple timelines, allowing them to offer guidance based on events that existed in various possible futures. Carol began to understand that the CB radio had become a conduit connecting different moments in trucking history, allowing drivers from across decades to share the same airwaves regardless of when they were actually traveling the highways. The voices spoke of a great network that linked all professional drivers across time, creating a community that transcended the normal limitations of mortality and temporal sequence. They explained that certain routes and certain trucks could access this network under specific conditions, usually during moments of particular isolation or need. The conversation revealed that Carol herself had been participating in this temporal communication network for years without realizing it, her voice reaching back to help drivers from previous decades, just as their voices now reached forward to assist her current journey. The seemingly routine traffic updates and friendly conversations she'd shared over the years had been part of a larger pattern of mutual support that operated across multiple dimensions of time and space. As Carol completed her delivery in Kansas City and prepared for her next load assignment, the temporal voices began to fade back to their normal time periods, though not before expressing gratitude for the opportunity to reconnect across the years. Iron Horse mentioned that he would listen for her voice during his own difficult trips in the past, while Silverbird promised to continue providing weather warnings for dangerous conditions that Carol might encounter in her future travels. The CB radio returned to normal operation, but Carol now understood that she was part of something much larger than the simple community of contemporary drivers she had always assumed she was communicating with during her journeys across the American highway system. Let's dive into the next story. Robert Hayes had been driving the same route between Portland and Seattle for 8 years. making the run twice weekly with loads of timber products and manufactured goods. The journey typically took about 4 hours, including mandatory rest stops, following Interstate 5 through familiar territory that had become as predictable as his own backyard. He knew every exit, every truck stop, and every way station along the route, had memorized the locations of the best coffee and the cleanest restrooms, and could navigate the journey almost without conscious thought. On this particular Tuesday morning, Robert noticed a truck stop that he'd never seen before. Despite having driven past this exact location hundreds of times over the years, the facility appeared to be brand new, with fresh asphalt in the parking lot and gleaming fuel pumps that reflected the early morning sunlight. The sign identified it as Crossroads Travel Plaza, and it offered all the standard amenities: diesel fuel, a restaurant, a convenience store, and shower facilities. Everything about the place looked normal and inviting, exactly the kind of well-maintained facility that professional drivers appreciated finding on their routes. Robert pulled into the truck stop primarily out of curiosity, wanting to investigate this new addition to his familiar route and perhaps grab a cup of coffee before continuing to Seattle. The parking lot was spacious and well-designed, with clearly marked spaces for trucks of various sizes and configurations. Several other commercial vehicles were already parked at different positions around the lot, their drivers presumably taking advantage of the facilities or required rest periods mandated by federal hours service regulations. The convenience store contained all the expected merchandise: snacks, beverages, travel supplies, and trucking-related items like logbooks and tie-down straps. The prices were reasonable, the selection was adequate, and the staff member behind the counter was friendly and professional. Robert purchased a large coffee and a package of beef jerky, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that was common between drivers and truck stop employees. The clerk mentioned that the facility had recently opened, which explained why Robert hadn't noticed it during his previous trips along this route. After completing his purchase, Robert returned to his truck and continued toward Seattle, thinking little more about the new truck stop beyond a mental note that it would be a convenient option for future trips. His delivery proceeded normally, and he loaded a return shipment of electronics equipment for transport back to Portland. The return journey began in the early afternoon, with Robert following his usual schedule and route planning to ensure compliance with driving time limitations and required rest periods. As he approached the area where he had stopped that morning, Robert was surprised to see the Crossroads Travel Plaza again. According to his understanding of the geography, the truck stop should have been behind him on the southbound side of the interstate. But here it was appearing on the northbound side as well. This seemed unusual, but not impossible. Many truck stops had facilities on both sides of divided highways to serve traffic traveling in either direction. Robert decided to stop again, partly out of continued curiosity and partly because he needed to purchase additional fuel. The northbound facility appeared identical to the morning location, with the same layout, the same signage, and even the same vehicles parked in the lot. Robert recognized several of the trucks from his earlier stop, though he found it somewhat coincidental that the same drivers would be taking their breaks at precisely the same times on both the southbound and northbound sections of their journeys. The convenience store contained the same merchandise in identical arrangements, and the clerk behind the counter was the same person who had served him that morning. When Robert mentioned that he had stopped at the southbound location earlier, the clerk seemed confused and insisted that there was only one Crossroads Travel Plaza in this area. According to the employee, the facility served traffic in both directions from this single location, though Robert was certain he had approached from different directions during his 2 visits. The clerk's confusion was mild and friendly, but it created a nagging sense that something about the situation wasn't quite right. Robert's 3rd encounter with the Crossroads Travel Plaza occurred 2 days later, during his next scheduled run between Portland and Seattle. This time, he was specifically watching for the facility, curious to understand its actual location and configuration. To his surprise, he found the truck stop at a different milepost than either of his previous encounters, positioned at a location where he was certain no such facility had existed during his 8 years of driving this route. The building appeared identical to his previous visits, but its position on the highway was definitively different. Over the following weeks, Robert began documenting his encounters with the Crossroads Travel Plaza, noting the time, date, direction of travel, and apparent location of the facility during each visit. The truck stop appeared consistently, but never in the same location twice, moving up and down the interstate in a pattern that defied geographical logic. Sometimes it appeared on the eastbound side of the highway, sometimes on the westbound side, and occasionally it seemed to be positioned at interchanges where Robert was certain no truck stop had ever been built. The facility's staff and customers remained remarkably consistent despite its shifting location. Robert began recognizing the same faces among both the employees and the other drivers who frequented the place, as if the same people were somehow connected to the truck stop, regardless of where it manifested along the highway. Conversations with these individuals revealed that they, like Robert, had been encountering the Crossroads Travel Plaza for varying lengths of time, and many had similar experiences of finding the facility in different locations during subsequent visits. The merchandise in the convenience store began to change in ways that reflected Robert's specific needs and preferences, stocking items that he typically purchased from other truck stops along his route. The coffee was always brewed exactly to his taste. The beef jerky was always the specific brand and flavor he preferred, and the fuel prices were consistently lower than competing stations in the area. It was as if the facility was adapting itself to serve his particular requirements, anticipating his needs in ways that went beyond normal customer service. Other drivers who used the Crossroads Travel Plaza reported similar experiences of personalized service and merchandise selection that seemed tailored to their individual preferences. The facility appeared to be somehow learning from each customer's purchasing patterns and adjusting its offerings accordingly. More unsettling was the observation that the truck stop seemed to appear most frequently when drivers were experiencing fatigue, stress, or other conditions that made a rest break particularly necessary or welcome. Robert's logbook entries began showing discrepancies in time and mileage that corresponded to his visits to the Crossroads Travel Plaza. Stops that he remembered lasting 30 or 40 minutes were recorded as much longer durations, sometimes adding several hours to his trip time, despite his clear memory of brief visits. The extra time didn't seem to affect his delivery schedules, as if the temporal anomalies were somehow compensated for by other adjustments to his journey duration. The most disturbing discovery came when Robert attempted to research the Crossroads Travel Plaza using online resources and trucking industry databases. No such facility appeared in any official listings, trucking guides, or business directories. The truck stop had no corporate ownership records, no construction permits, and no history of existence in any government or commercial databases. According to every official source, The Crossroads Travel Plaza simply didn't exist. Despite Robert's repeated visits and interactions with its staff and facilities over a period of several months. Let's dive into the next story. Diana Foster had been driving the same route from Chicago to Detroit for nearly a decade, hauling automotive parts between manufacturing facilities that supplied the major car companies. The journey was routine and predictable, following Interstate 94 through familiar territory that included the same rest stops, truck stops, and landmarks she'd grown accustomed to seeing twice weekly. Her Kenworth had accumulated over 800,000 miles during her career, and she took pride in maintaining both her vehicle and her perfect safety record through years of professional driving. On this particular Thursday evening, Diana was running slightly behind schedule due to a delayed loading process at the Chicago facility. The sun was setting as she passed through Kalamazoo, Michigan, and she was calculating whether to complete the journey that night or take a mandatory rest break to comply with hours of service regulations. The traffic was light, typical for this time of evening on this section of interstate, and her truck was performing flawlessly despite its high mileage. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when Diana noticed that the landmarks along the highway seemed to be appearing in reverse order. She passed a distinctive water tower that should have been much further ahead on her route, followed by a rest area that she was certain she'd already passed an hour earlier. Her GPS system showed her current location correctly, but the physical landmarks suggested she was somehow retracing her path despite maintaining consistent forward motion on the interstate. Diana pulled into the next available truck stop to check her location and review her route planning. The facility was one she recognized from hundreds of previous trips, but something about it felt subtly different. The layout was familiar, yet somehow mirrored, as if she were seeing a reflected version of the truck stop rather than the actual facility. The fuel pumps were positioned on the opposite side from where she remembered them, and the convenience store entrance was located where the exit should have been. Inside the store, Diana encountered other drivers who seemed equally confused about the facility's altered layout. Several truckers were discussing the same geographical inconsistencies she'd observed, comparing notes about landmarks appearing out of sequence and familiar locations seeming somehow reversed. The clerk behind the counter appeared normal and helpful, but when Diana asked for directions to confirm her location, the employee provided instructions that would have taken her backwards along the route she'd just traveled. Returning to her truck, Diana noticed that her reflection in the side mirrors looked wrong somehow, as if she were seeing herself from an impossible angle. Her movements appeared normal, but the reflected image seemed to lag behind her actual motions by a fraction of a second. When she raised her hand to adjust her mirror, the reflection began the movement before she did, creating a temporal displacement that made her question whether she was seeing her own reflection or that of someone else entirely. As Diana resumed her journey toward Detroit, she realized that the highway itself had taken on a mirrored quality. Road signs appeared to be displaying correct information, but the text seemed somehow reversed, readable, but creating a sense of wrongness that she couldn't quite identify. Other vehicles on the highway moved in normal patterns, but their positions relative to her truck suggested they were traveling in the opposite direction, despite appearing to maintain proper lane discipline for eastbound traffic. Her CB radio began picking up conversations from other drivers who seemed to be experiencing similar geographical confusion. Truckers were reporting familiar routes that had somehow become unfamiliar, landmarks that appeared in wrong locations, and destinations that seemed to be getting further away despite forward progress. The conversations had a dreamlike quality, with participants discussing impossible scenarios as if they were routine occurrences that required only minor adjustments to navigation plans. Diana's fuel gauge began showing readings that contradicted her actual consumption patterns. Despite driving for several hours, the needle indicated she had more fuel than when she'd started the journey. Her odometer was recording miles in reverse, showing lower readings as she continued to drive forward. The truck's electronic systems were displaying impossible data, suggesting she was simultaneously moving forward and backward through time and space while maintaining normal highway speeds. The sky above the interstate took on an unusual quality, as if she were seeing it reflected in water rather than looking directly up at it. Stars appeared during daylight hours, while the sun cast shadows that fell in directions that defied the basic principles of celestial mechanics. The landscape on either side of the highway showed scenes that seemed familiar but wrong, like photographs that had been flipped horizontally, creating recognizable but somehow impossible views. Other trucks on the highway began displaying license plates and company markings that appeared backwards, though the drivers seemed unaware of any abnormality. When Diana attempted to read the text on passing vehicles, she found that she could understand the reversed writing as easily as normal text, as if her perception had adapted to the mirrored environment. Road signs continued to provide accurate directional information, but the mileage indicators showed distances that increased rather than decreased as she approached her destination. The experience intensified as Diana neared what should have been the Detroit metropolitan area. Familiar buildings and industrial facilities appeared in their expected locations, but with reversed orientations, as if the entire cityscape had been flipped along an invisible axis. The Detroit River flowed in the opposite direction, and the skyline showed a mirror image of the city she'd visited hundreds of times throughout her driving career. Diana's delivery address led her to a facility that was simultaneously familiar and completely wrong. The building matched her expectations in every detail except for its reversed layout, with loading docks positioned where they had never been before, and office entrances located on opposite sides of the structure. The receiving personnel recognized her and processed her delivery paperwork normally, despite operating in what appeared to be a mirror image of their actual workplace. As Diana completed her delivery and prepared for the return journey to Chicago, she began to understand that she had somehow entered a reflected version of her familiar route, a mirror highway that paralleled the normal interstate system, but operated according to different rules of geography and physics. The return trip would require her to navigate this reversed landscape, following familiar roads that had become strange and mysterious, until she could find her way back to the normal world she'd always known. Let's dive into the next story. Frank Williams had driven the stretch of Interstate Lepady between Omaha and Des Moines so many times that he could navigate it in his sleep, which was almost necessary given that this particular run often required driving through the night to meet delivery schedules. The route covered 135 miles of mostly flat Nebraska and Iowa farmland, punctuated by small towns and truck stops that had become as familiar as his own neighborhood. Frank had been making this run for Global Freight Solutions for 7 years, hauling everything from agricultural equipment to consumer electronics along this well-traveled corridor. On this foggy Tuesday night in October, Frank was transporting a load of furniture bound for a department store distribution center in Des Moines. The visibility was poor, due to dense fog that had settled over the rural landscape, reducing his normal highway speed to a cautious 45 miles per hour. His truck's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the murky air, illuminating the road surface just far enough ahead to maintain safe, following distances from the occasional other vehicles sharing the highway. The first sign that something was unusual occurred when Frank passed the same billboard advertising a local steakhouse 3 times within what should have been a 30-mile stretch of highway. The sign was distinctive, featuring a cartoon cowboy and advertising world's best prime rib, positioned at a specific milepost that Frank had noted during his regular trips over the years. According to his truck's odometer and GPS system, he was making normal forward progress, but the repeated appearance of the identical billboard suggested something was wrong with his navigation or perception. Frank's CB radio was picking up transmissions from other drivers who seemed to be experiencing similar confusion about their locations and progress along the interstate. A driver with the handle Cornhusker was reporting that he'd passed the same rest area 4 times, despite maintaining steady eastbound travel. Another trucker, calling himself Prairie Wind, mentioned seeing the same grain elevator repeatedly, even though such structures typically appeared at intervals of many miles along rural highways. The GPS system in Frank's truck began displaying impossible information, showing his current location as a dot that appeared to be moving in a small circle rather than following the linear path of the interstate. The device indicated that he was making progress toward his destination, but the estimated arrival time kept resetting to the same value every few minutes, as if his journey was somehow starting over repeatedly. The satellite navigation seemed unable to track his actual forward movement, despite showing clear signal reception. Frank decided to stop at the next available exit to investigate his location and perhaps wait for the fog to clear. The exit ramp appeared exactly where his route knowledge suggested it should be, marked with familiar signage for a small Iowa town that served as a regular landmark on his trips. However, as he descended the ramp and approached the intersection at the bottom, he found himself merging back onto the interstate rather than entering the town he'd intended to visit. The merge back onto the highway placed Frank at precisely the same location where he'd decided to take the exit, creating a seamless loop that brought him back to his starting point without any apparent passage of time or distance. His fuel gauge hadn't changed, his odometer reading remained constant, and his electronic logbook showed no record of the detour he'd just completed. It was as if the exit ramp existed only to return him to the exact same position on the interstate. Frank attempted to use his cell phone to contact his dispatcher and report the navigation problems he was experiencing, but the device showed no signal despite normally having excellent coverage along this route. The phone's clock displayed the same time repeatedly, never advancing beyond 11:47 p.m., regardless of how long he continued driving. His truck's dashboard clock showed the same temporal anomaly, frozen at a specific moment that seemed to correspond with his first encounter with the repeating billboard. Other drivers on the CB radio began reporting similar experiences with exits that led nowhere, rest stops that couldn't be found despite clear signage, and mile markers that appeared in the wrong sequence. The fog seemed to be creating some form of navigational distortion that prevented normal travel along the interstate. However, the weather conditions alone couldn't explain the temporal anomalies and geographical impossibilities that multiple drivers were encountering simultaneously. Frank's truck began consuming fuel at an impossible rate, the gauge dropping steadily despite his consistent speed and the fact that his odometer wasn't recording additional miles. At the same time, his cargo seemed to be getting heavier, requiring more power to maintain highway speeds on level terrain. The trailer's weight distribution felt wrong, as if the furniture inside was somehow increasing in mass or changing configuration during the journey through the fog. The radio transmissions from other truckers became increasingly urgent as drivers realized they were trapped in some form of geographical anomaly that prevented them from reaching their intended destinations. Some reported seeing the same vehicles repeatedly, as if a limited number of trucks were cycling through the same section of highway indefinitely. Others mentioned landmarks that appeared and disappeared in patterns that suggested the landscape itself was somehow unstable. Frank attempted to break free from the loop by making an abrupt lane change and reducing his speed to the minimum safe velocity, hoping to disrupt whatever pattern was keeping him trapped on this section of interstate. The maneuver seemed to work briefly as new landmarks began appearing and his GPS showed forward progress toward Des Moines. However, within minutes, he found himself approaching the familiar steakhouse billboard once again. Despite his efforts to alter his route and driving pattern, the fog began to thin slightly as dawn approached, though the time stamp on Frank's electronic devices continued to show the same late-night hour when the phenomenon had begun. Through the clearing air, he could see other trucks that appeared to be traveling the same circular route, their headlights and taillights creating a slow-moving carousel of commercial vehicles trapped within the same geographical loop. The drivers seemed unaware of their repetitive path, continuing to broadcast normal traffic reports and casual conversation over the CB radio. Frank realized that escape from the time loop would require something more than conventional navigation or route changes. The phenomenon seemed to be connected to the fog, the specific time period, and perhaps the particular combination of vehicles that had been traveling this section of interstate when the anomaly began. He would need to find a way to break the pattern that had trapped him and the other drivers in this endless repetition of the same highway segment, cycling through the same locations and experiences until something changed the fundamental conditions that had created their temporal and geographical prison. Let's dive into the next story. Ellen Martinez was approaching the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, when she first noticed the figure standing beside the highway in the pale light of dawn. The person appeared to be a young woman carrying a small duffel bag, dressed in clothing appropriate for travel, but somehow timeless in style, as if she could have been waiting there for decades without looking out of place. Ellen had been driving commercial vehicles for 18 years and had occasionally picked up hitchhikers during her earlier career, though company policies and insurance concerns had made such practices increasingly risky and discouraged. The hitchhiker made no gesture to request a ride, simply standing quietly beside the road as Ellen's Freightliner approached and passed. In her side mirror, Ellen watched the figure remain motionless, neither waving nor turning to watch the truck disappear into the distance. There was something distinctly patient about the woman's posture, as if she were accustomed to waiting and had no particular urgency about reaching her destination or attracting the attention of passing motorists. Ellen's load consisted of consumer electronics bound for retail stores in Phoenix, a routine haul along a route she'd traveled dozens of times over the years. The cargo was properly secured, her documentation was complete, and her truck was performing normally after a recent maintenance inspection. Everything about the journey was standard and professional, following established procedures that had served her well throughout her driving career. The only unusual element was the persistent memory of the hitchhiker's calm, almost serene expression. 23 miles further north, Ellen encountered the same woman again, standing in an identical posture beside a different section of highway. The hitchhiker wore the same clothing and carried the same duffel bag, maintaining the same patient stance that suggested long familiarity with roadside waiting. Ellen checked her mirrors and confirmed that she had indeed passed this location for the first time, making it impossible for the woman to have somehow traveled ahead of her truck to appear at this new position. Ellen's CB radio crackled with transmissions from other drivers, discussing unusual sightings along various highways throughout Arizona and neighboring states. A trucker with the handle Desert Rat mentioned seeing the same hitchhiker at multiple locations during his run from El Paso to Las Vegas, while another driver, calling himself Cactus Jack, reported similar encounters during completely different routes and time periods. The descriptions matched Elon's observations perfectly, suggesting that multiple drivers were encountering the same individual under impossible circumstances. The hitchhiker appeared a third time near the Phoenix city limits, still maintaining her patient roadside vigil beside the interstate. Ellen decided to pull over at the next available truck stop to document these encounters and perhaps contact her dispatcher about the unusual situation. The facility was busy with other commercial vehicles, and Ellen engaged in conversations with several drivers who reported similar experiences with the mysterious woman during their own travels throughout the Southwest. One driver, a veteran trucker named Ray Thompson, mentioned that he'd been seeing the same hitchhiker intermittently for over a decade during his runs through Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. According to Ray, the woman never appeared to age or change her clothing, maintaining exactly the same appearance and posture during encounters that spanned multiple years. Other drivers confirmed similar long-term sightings, suggesting that the hitchhiker had been a persistent presence along southwestern highways for much longer than would be possible for any normal person. Ellen's truck began experiencing minor mechanical issues that coincided with her encounters with the hitchhiker. The engine developed an intermittent misfire that couldn't be diagnosed by her usual troubleshooting methods, and her air conditioning system began producing cold air that carried a faint scent of desert flowers. Despite being in a closed-loop system, the radio began picking up stations that weren't broadcasting when Ellen tried to tune them in directly, playing music from decades past that seemed somehow connected to the time periods when other drivers first reported seeing the mysterious woman. The GPS system in Elon's truck started displaying route suggestions that deviated from the most direct path to her delivery destination, recommending detours through small towns and scenic routes that would add unnecessary time to her journey. When Ellen followed one of these alternative routes out of curiosity, she encountered the hitchhiker again, this time standing beside a desert road that appeared on no official maps. The woman seemed more solid and present at this remote location, as if the isolation strengthened whatever force allowed her to manifest beside the highways. Ellen stopped her truck and approached the hitchhiker on foot, hoping to offer assistance or at least understand the nature of these repeated encounters. The woman appeared normal in every way except for a timeless quality that was difficult to define, as if she existed slightly outside the normal flow of time and space. Her voice was clear and pleasant when she spoke, explaining that she was traveling toward destinations that couldn't be reached by conventional transportation methods. following routes that connected places separated by more than simple geographical distance. The hitchhiker revealed that she was part of a network of travelers who moved between different versions of the highway system, helping to guide drivers who had become lost, not just geographically, but temporally and dimensionally. Ellen learned that certain trucks and certain drivers were particularly susceptible to these displacements, especially those who had spent many years traveling the same routes and had developed deep familiarity with the rhythm and character of specific highways. According to the hitchhiker, Ellen's truck had been gradually shifting between different versions of the interstate system during her years of driving, occasionally slipping into alternate configurations where the roads connected different times and places. The mechanical issues and navigational anomalies were symptoms of this dimensional instability, signs that her vehicle was no longer entirely anchored to the conventional highway network that most drivers experienced. The woman offered to help Ellen navigate these alternate routes, explaining that drivers who understood the true nature of the highway system could access destinations and time periods that were normally unreachable. However, she warned that such knowledge came with responsibilities and risks, as travelers who moved between different versions of reality could easily become lost in ways that went far beyond simple geographical confusion. Ellen had to decide whether to accept the hitchhiker's guidance and learn to navigate the hidden aspects of the highway system, or attempt to return her truck to the normal roads she'd always known. The choice would determine not only her immediate destination, but the entire future direction of her driving career, potentially opening access to routes and deliveries that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional transportation, but also requiring her to abandon the familiar world of routine commercial trucking that had defined her professional identity for nearly 2 decades. Let's dive into the next story. Gary Sullivan was hauling a load of construction equipment from Dallas to Oklahoma City when he first noticed the convoy of older trucks that seemed to be traveling the same route at precisely his speed. The vehicles appeared to be from an earlier era of commercial trucking, with chrome bumpers and classic cab designs that had been popular in the 1970s and 1980s, but were rarely seen on modern highways. Despite their vintage appearance, the trucks maintained perfect formation and road discipline, suggesting professional drivers who were highly skilled at convoy operations. The lead truck was a burgundy Kenworth with elaborate pinstriping and custom chrome accessories that reflected the afternoon sunlight in brilliant flashes. Behind it followed a blue Peterbilt, a white Freightliner, and a green Mack truck, each one meticulously maintained despite their apparent age. The convoy maintained proper following distances and used appropriate signaling for lane changes, operating with the kind of coordination that required either extensive experience working together or some form of communication system that Gary couldn't detect on his CB radio. Gary attempted to contact the convoy drivers using Channel 19, the standard trucker's frequency, but received no response despite clear line-of-sight visibility to the other vehicles. He tried several other common CB channels with similar results, suggesting that either the vintage trucks weren't equipped with modern radio equipment, or they were operating on frequencies that his radio couldn't access. The silence was particularly unusual, given that most professional drivers appreciated contact with other truckers, especially during long hauls through relatively empty stretches of highway. As the convoy maintained its position relative to Gary's truck, he began noticing details about the vehicles that seemed inconsistent with their apparent vintage. The trucks displayed company logos and color schemes that Gary recognized from his early years in the trucking industry. Businesses that had gone out of operation decades ago due to deregulation and economic changes in the transportation sector. Some of the trailers bore the names of shipping companies that Gary remembered from his father's stories about trucking in the 1960s and 1970s, before computerized logistics and satellite tracking had transformed the industry. The convoy drivers themselves were visible through their cab windows, appearing to be middle-aged men wearing clothing styles that matched the era of their trucks. They wore trucker caps, plaid shirts, and denim jackets that looked authentic rather than nostalgic, as if they were genuinely from the time period when such attire was common among professional drivers. Their driving behavior reflected older industry practices, including hand signals and courtesy protocols that had largely disappeared from modern highway culture. Gary's truck began experiencing unusual performance, characteristics that seemed to correspond with his proximity to the vintage convoy. His electronic fuel injection system began operating in a manner more consistent with older carburetor technology, producing the distinctive exhaust note and power delivery patterns of trucks from previous decades. His automatic transmission shifted with the feel of a manual gearbox, requiring timing and technique that Gary hadn't used since his early driving years before modern automated systems became standard. The highway itself seemed to change subtly as Gary continued traveling alongside the phantom convoy. Road surface textures felt different beneath his tires, with the rougher characteristics of asphalt that hadn't been improved by modern paving techniques. Overhead signs appeared in older fonts and color schemes, displaying mileage information to destinations that matched historical rather than current highway designations. Even the landscape alongside the interstate took on qualities that suggested an earlier era, with billboard advertising and architectural styles that belonged to previous decades. Gary's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed to be from the convoy, though the voices were discussing routes, regulations, and industry conditions that corresponded to trucking as it had existed 20 or 30 years earlier. The drivers talked about fuel prices, weigh station procedures, and customer relationships, using terminology and references that reflected the business environment of previous decades. They mentioned truck stops and shipping facilities that Gary knew had been closed or demolished years ago. The convoy's route began deviating from the standard interstate system, taking exits and following roads that appeared on Gary's GPS system, but led to destinations that shouldn't have been accessible via those particular interchanges. The vintage trucks seemed to be following a version of the highway network that existed in the past, when different connections and routing options had been available to commercial drivers. Gary found his own truck being guided along these alternate routes, despite his GPS displaying impossible navigation instructions. As evening approached, the convoy led Gary to a truck stop that perfectly matched the appearance and atmosphere of facilities from decades past. The building showed the architectural style and signage of the 1970s, complete with neon lighting and design elements that had been standard during that era. The fuel pumps were older models that required manual operation, and the prices displayed reflected costs from previous decades rather than current market rates. Inside the truck stop, Gary encountered other drivers who appeared to be from the same time period as the convoy members, wearing period-appropriate clothing and discussing industry issues that had been relevant years or decades ago. The restaurant served food prepared in styles that had been popular during earlier eras of truck stop cuisine. And the merchandise in the convenience store included items that hadn't been manufactured for many years. The entire facility seemed to be operating according to business practices and social customs from the past. Gary gradually realized that he had somehow joined a convoy of drivers who were traveling through a version of the highway system as it had existed in previous decades, complete with the routes, regulations, and commercial environment of earlier eras in trucking history. The Phantom Convoy was composed of drivers and trucks that had somehow become permanently connected to the highway network, as it had been during their original time period, continuing their journeys indefinitely through a transportation system that existed parallel to, but separate from, the modern interstate system. The convoy leader, a veteran driver who introduced himself as Big Jim Patterson, explained that certain trucks and drivers who had spent many years on specific routes sometimes became so connected to the highway system that they continued traveling even after circumstances should have ended their careers. They existed in a state between past and present, following routes that connected different time periods and serving customers who needed deliveries that couldn't be made through conventional modern trucking operations. Gary had to decide whether to continue traveling with the Phantom Convoy, accepting a role in this timeless version of the trucking industry, or attempt to return to the modern highway system and resume his normal career delivering contemporary cargo to current-day destinations. The choice would determine whether he remained part of the present-day transportation industry or joined the ranks of drivers who had become permanent residents of the highway network, traveling forever between past and present along routes that existed outside normal time. Let's dive into the next story. Sarah Kim had always prided herself on being exceptionally well-organized and methodical in her approach to long-haul trucking, maintaining detailed records of routes, fuel consumption, and delivery schedules that had earned her recognition as one of the most reliable drivers in her company's fleet. Her GPS system was a top-of-the-line commercial unit, specifically designed for commercial vehicles, with real-time traffic updates, way station information, and routing algorithms that accounted for truck-specific restrictions and requirements. She updated the software regularly and had never experienced significant navigation problems during her 6 years of professional driving. On this particular journey from Seattle to Denver, Sarah was transporting a load of computer servers and networking equipment that required careful handling due to both the value and fragility of the cargo. The route she'd planned followed Interstate 84 through Oregon and Idaho before connecting to Interstate 80 across Wyoming and into Colorado, a path she'd traveled successfully dozens of times with various types of freight. Weather conditions were favorable. Her truck had recently passed a comprehensive maintenance inspection, and all documentation was properly completed according to Department of Transportation regulations. The first indication that her navigation system was malfunctioning came approximately 4 hours into the journey, as Sarah was traveling through the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. Her GPS began suggesting a detour onto a state highway that wasn't marked on any of her paper maps or trucking atlases, claiming that construction on the interstate would cause significant delays. The recommended alternate route appeared to lead through mountainous terrain that would be unsuitable for her heavy load and lengthy trailer configuration. Sarah decided to continue on the interstate despite the GPS recommendations, but the device became increasingly insistent about the detour, repeatedly recalculating her route and providing audio warnings about impending delays and road closures. The electronic displays showed traffic conditions that contradicted what Sarah could observe directly, indicating heavy congestion and construction zones on highway sections that appeared clear and well-maintained through her windshield. As Sarah progressed further into her journey, the GPS began displaying geographic information that was clearly incorrect, showing her current location in areas that were hundreds of miles from her actual position. According to the device, she was simultaneously traveling through portions of Nevada, Utah, and Montana, despite being clearly visible on Interstate 84 in Oregon. The satellite navigation seemed to have lost any connection to her actual location, providing routing instructions for roads that didn't exist anywhere near her current position. The recommended detour route became more insistent, with the GPS repeatedly announcing turn-by-turn directions for exits and highways that Sarah couldn't see from the interstate. The device's voice guidance began describing landmarks and geographic features that weren't present in the landscape outside her windows, mentioning mountain ranges, river crossings, and urban areas that bore no resemblance to the Oregon terrain through which she was actually traveling. The navigation system seemed to be guiding her through an entirely different version of the American highway system. Sarah pulled over at a truck stop to recalibrate her GPS and consult her paper maps, hoping to resolve the electronic navigation problems before they led to significant delays in her delivery schedule. However, the truck stop she entered appeared on none of her written materials, despite being clearly marked with standard signage and populated with other commercial vehicles. The facility offered typical services and amenities, but its location made no sense according to any official highway maps or trucking guides. Other drivers at the truck stop reported similar navigation problems, describing GPS systems that were providing impossible routing instructions and displaying geographic data that contradicted observable reality. Several truckers mentioned being directed to take exits that led to roads that didn't appear on any maps, while others reported electronic devices that showed their trucks traveling through multiple states simultaneously. The phenomenon seemed to be affecting a wide range of different GPS manufacturers and software versions. Sarah attempted to contact her dispatcher to report the navigation difficulties, but her cell phone couldn't establish a reliable connection despite showing strong signal strength. When calls did connect briefly, the conversations were filled with static and distortion that made communication impossible. Her satellite radio lost signal repeatedly, cycling through stations that seemed to be broadcasting from locations that couldn't be reached by any known satellite coverage patterns. The GPS continued to insist on the mysterious detour, now claiming that her intended route was completely impassable due to conditions that Sarah couldn't verify through any official traffic information sources. The device began showing arrival times and fuel consumption, calculations that were mathematically impossible given her truck's specifications and the distance to her destination. The electronic navigation seemed to be operating according to a completely different set of physical laws and geographical relationships. Sarah made the decision to ignore her GPS completely and rely solely on paper maps and road signs for the remainder of her journey. However, the highway signs began providing conflicting information, with mile markers that didn't progress in logical sequence and destination indicators that pointed toward cities in wrong directions, according to her understanding of regional geography. The interstate itself seemed to be following a path that didn't match the route shown on any of her written materials. As daylight faded and Sarah continued her eastward journey, she realized that her truck was traveling through landscape that didn't correspond to any terrain she'd ever seen along this route. The mountains, valleys, and river systems visible from the highway bore no resemblance to the geography of Oregon, Idaho, or any other states she should have been crossing. The scenery was beautiful and seemed natural, but it belonged to regions that didn't exist on any maps she'd studied during years of professional driving. Sarah's fuel consumption began following patterns that contradicted her normal experience with this type of load and terrain, using significantly more diesel than should have been required for the apparent distance traveled. Her truck's performance characteristics changed subtly, as if the vehicle was operating under different atmospheric conditions, or gravitational influences than those found in normal terrestrial environments. The engine worked harder despite traveling on apparently level highway sections. The realization gradually dawned that Sarah's GPS navigation error hadn't simply provided incorrect directions within the normal highway system, but had somehow guided her truck into an alternate version of the interstate network that existed in parallel to, but separate from the roads used by conventional traffic. She was traveling through a transportation system that followed different geographical and physical rules, leading to destinations that might exist in entirely different versions of reality than the Denver she'd intended to reach with her cargo of computer equipment. Let's dive into the next story. Tom Bradley accepted the assignment without asking too many questions, as was his usual practice when dealing with high-paying loads that came available on short notice. The pickup was scheduled for a pharmaceutical distribution facility in Indianapolis, with delivery to a medical research center in Atlanta within 48 hours. The pay scale was generous enough to suggest either urgent timing requirements or cargo that required special handling procedures, though the manifest listed only standard medical supplies and laboratory equipment that shouldn't have warranted premium transportation rates. The loading process at the Indianapolis facility proceeded normally, with warehouse personnel using standard procedures to secure pallets of sealed containers and equipment cases in Tom's refrigerated trailer. The cargo appeared professional and properly packaged, bearing the usual assortment of medical supply company logos and handling instructions. Temperature requirements were clearly specified, and Tom's reefer unit was functioning perfectly after a recent maintenance inspection. Everything about the load seemed routine, except for the unusual amount of paperwork involved and the extra security measures implemented during the loading process. Tom had been driving temperature-controlled loads for nearly 12 years, transporting everything from pharmaceuticals to fresh produce across the eastern United States. His Volvo tractor and Thermo King refrigerated trailer were well maintained and reliable, capable of maintaining precise temperature control regardless of external weather conditions. His safety record was exemplary, and he held all necessary endorsements for transporting hazardous materials, though this particular load wasn't classified as dangerous goods according to Department of Transportation regulations. The first unusual occurrence happened approximately 3 hours into the journey, as Tom was traveling south on Interstate 65 through Kentucky. He began hearing sounds from the trailer that couldn't be explained by normal road vibration or the operation of the refrigeration equipment. The noises resembled soft crying or whimpering, as if someone in distress was trapped inside the cargo compartment. Tom pulled over at the next available truck stop to inspect his load, but found all seals intact and security devices properly positioned. Tom's inspection of the trailer exterior revealed no obvious problems with the refrigeration system or cargo securing equipment. The temperature monitoring system showed consistent readings within the specified range, and there were no signs of mechanical problems or cargo shifting that could account for the unusual sounds. However, when Tom placed his ear against the trailer wall, he could clearly hear what sounded like multiple voices expressing pain or sorrow, though the sounds were muffled and indistinct. The crying sounds continued intermittently as Tom resumed his journey toward Atlanta, sometimes growing louder during specific driving conditions, such as acceleration or braking. The voices seemed to be responding to the motion of the truck, becoming more agitated during lane changes or when negotiating curves in the highway. Tom tried adjusting his driving style to minimize sudden movements, but the sounds persisted regardless of how smoothly he operated the vehicle. Tom's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed somehow connected to his cargo, though the conversations were fragmented and difficult to understand. Voices spoke about medical procedures, research protocols, and patient care using terminology that was both technical and emotionally charged. The transmissions had an urgent, desperate quality that contrasted sharply with the usual casual chatter typical of trucker communications on the interstate highway system. As night fell and Tom continued south through Tennessee, the sounds from his trailer became more distinct and disturbing. The crying had developed into what sounded like pleading or begging, with voices that seemed to be asking for help or relief from some form of suffering. The sounds were clearly human in origin, though Tom knew that his cargo consisted only of medical supplies and equipment, rather than any living beings that could produce such vocalizations. Tom contacted his dispatcher via satellite communication to report the unusual situation, but the response was dismissive and focused only on delivery schedule requirements. When Tom mentioned the sounds coming from his trailer, he was told that temperature-controlled loads sometimes produced unusual noises due to cargo settling and equipment operation. The dispatcher insisted that Tom continue to Atlanta without delay and avoid any unnecessary stops or inspections that might compromise the cargo's temperature integrity. The refrigeration unit began operating erratically, despite showing normal diagnostic readings on Tom's monitoring equipment. The compressor cycled on and off in patterns that didn't correspond to temperature requirements, and the unit produced sounds that blended with the crying voices to create an increasingly disturbing audio environment. Tom couldn't determine whether the mechanical sounds were actually malfunctioning equipment or additional voices joining the chorus of distress emanating from his cargo. Tom's truck began consuming fuel at an accelerated rate, as if the trailer was somehow heavier than the weight indicated on his bills of lading. The increased load seemed to correspond with the intensity of the crying sounds, suggesting that whatever was causing the vocalizations was also affecting the physical properties of his cargo. His truck's performance characteristics changed throughout the night, requiring constant adjustments to maintain highway speeds and fuel efficiency. Electronic devices in Tom's cab began malfunctioning in ways that seemed connected to the distressed voices in his trailer. His cell phone displayed error messages when he attempted to make calls. His GPS system showed impossible location readings, and his satellite radio produced static that seemed to contain fragments of the same pleading voices he was hearing from the cargo compartment. The truck's own electronic systems began showing warning lights for components that tested normal when checked with diagnostic equipment. As Tom approached the Atlanta metropolitan area, in the early morning hours. The sounds from his trailer reached a crescendo of anguish that was almost unbearable to endure. The voices seemed to be aware of their approaching destination, expressing increased desperation and fear about whatever awaited them at the medical research facility. Tom realized that his cargo was somehow more than the medical supplies listed on his manifest, though he couldn't understand the true nature of what he was transporting. The delivery address led Tom to a facility that looked more like a high-security laboratory than a standard medical supply distribution center. The building was surrounded by fences and security checkpoints, with personnel who seemed more concerned about preventing information leaks than ensuring proper handling of medical equipment. As Tom backed up to the receiving dock, the sounds from his trailer became almost frantic, as if the cargo was desperately trying to avoid being delivered to this particular destination. Tom watched as his cargo was unloaded by personnel wearing protective equipment that seemed excessive for handling standard medical supplies. The containers and equipment cases were moved with unusual care and immediately taken into secure areas of the facility, where Tom wasn't allowed to observe the unpacking process. The crying sounds continued until the trailer was completely empty, then stopped abruptly, leaving Tom with the disturbing realization that he had unknowingly participated in transporting something that was far different from the innocent medical supplies described in his shipping documentation. Let's dive into the next story. Angela Rodriguez was feeling the effects of 14 hours behind the wheel when she spotted the rest area sign promising facilities in 2 miles. The journey from Phoenix to Salt Lake City had been longer than expected due to construction delays and an unscheduled fuel stop, pushing her close to the federal limits for driving time without a mandatory rest period. Her Peterbilt was running smoothly despite the challenging mountain terrain, but Angela knew the importance of adhering to hours of service regulations, both for safety and legal compliance with Department of Transportation requirements. The rest area appeared exactly where the highway signage indicated it would be, nestled in a valley between pine-covered hills that provided a scenic and peaceful setting for weary travelers. The facility looked well-maintained and properly equipped, with clean restrooms, picnic tables, and informational displays about local geography and wildlife. Several other vehicles were parked in designated spaces, including a few other commercial trucks whose drivers were presumably taking their own required rest breaks during long-haul journeys across the western states. Angela parked her truck in an appropriately sized space and walked to the restroom facilities, appreciating the opportunity to stretch her legs and take care of personal needs after hours of concentrated driving. The rest area seemed unusually quiet and peaceful, with a quality of stillness that suggested it was located far from the noise and activity of the busy interstate highway. Even the sound of traffic seemed muted and distant, as if the facility existed in a pocket of calm, separate from the constant flow of vehicles on the nearby roadway. The restroom was clean and well supplied, though Angela noticed that the fixtures and decor seemed to represent a variety of different time periods, as if the facility had been renovated multiple times over many decades using whatever materials and styles were available during each upgrade. Some elements appeared modern and recently installed, while others had the characteristics of construction from the 1960s or 1970s. The overall effect was functional, but somehow timeless, as if the rest area existed outside normal temporal progression. When Angela returned to her truck, she discovered that several hours had passed according to her dashboard clock. though she was certain she had been away from the vehicle for no more than 20 or 30 minutes. Her electronic logbook showed a rest period that was much longer than her actual experience, and her truck's hour meter indicated extended idle time that didn't correspond to her memory of the break. The discrepancy was significant enough to affect her available driving hours and scheduling for the remainder of her trip to Salt Lake City. Other drivers in the rest area seemed to be experiencing similar temporal anomalies. Thompson mentioned that he had stopped for a brief 15-minute break, but found that his logbook recorded nearly 3 hours of rest time. Another trucker, calling herself Mountain Rose, reported that her delivery schedule had somehow adjusted itself to account for the extra time, as if the delays were automatically compensated for by changes in her routing or destination requirements. Angela attempted to contact her dispatcher to report the scheduling discrepancy, was unable to locate the communication satellites that should have been easily accessible from this geographic location. The truck's own communication systems seemed to be operating in a dead zone that shouldn't have existed according to coverage maps. Angela couldn't locate on any of her maps or GPS systems the signs referenced towns, landmarks, and geographic features that seemed to be positioned in the area but weren't documented in any official tourism guides or navigation databases. Some of the described locations sounded intriguing enough that Angela would have liked to visit them, but she couldn't determine how to reach them from the current highway system. As Angela prepared to resume her journey, she noticed that the rest area seemed to contain more facilities and amenities than she had initially observed. Walking paths extended into the surrounding forest, leading to additional picnic areas, scenic overlooks, and recreational facilities that hadn't been visible when she first arrived. The rest area appeared to be much larger and more developed than typical interstate facilities, offering opportunities for extended stays and outdoor activities that went far beyond the basic services normally provided for travelers. The exit from the rest area led back to the interstate, but the highway, Angela rejoined, seemed subtly different from the road she had been traveling before her stop. The landscape, while still recognizably Utah terrain, had characteristics that didn't match her previous observations or her familiarity with this route. The mountains were positioned differently. The valleys had altered configurations, and even the quality of sunlight seemed to have changed in ways that suggested a different time of day or season than when she had entered the rest area. Angela's GPS system began showing her location as being much further north than should have been possible, given her actual travel time and distance. According to the navigation display, she had somehow gained significant progress toward Salt Lake City during her rest stop, covering miles that she hadn't actually driven. The electronic mapping showed her truck's position, advancing along the interstate, despite the vehicle being stationary during the break, as if the rest area had somehow transported her to a different point along her intended route. The CB radio began picking up transmissions from other drivers who seemed to be discussing the same rest area, sharing experiences of temporal displacement and geographical inconsistencies that matched Angela's observations. The conversations suggested that the facility was known among certain truckers as a place where normal rules of time and space didn't apply, offering rest and recovery that went beyond simple physical relaxation to provide some form of temporal respite from the demands of commercial driving schedules. Angela realized that she had stumbled upon a rest area that existed between normal dimensions of time and space, providing services to travelers who needed more than conventional facilities could offer. The extra hours of rest, the geographical displacement, and the temporal adjustments to her schedule were all part of the facility's function as a way station that allowed drivers to recover from the accumulated stress of long-haul trucking in ways that conventional rest stops couldn't provide. As Angela continued toward Salt Lake City, she understood that her delivery schedule had been mysteriously adjusted to account for the time spent in the interdimensional rest area, and her truck's performance seemed improved by whatever restorative processes had occurred during the stop. The facility had somehow recharged both her physical energy and her vehicle's mechanical systems, preparing her for the remainder of her journey with renewed capability and endurance. She made a mental note of the rest area's location, realizing that she had discovered a resource that could be invaluable during future long-haul trips, though she suspected that the facility might not always be accessible to drivers who were simply looking for conventional rest stops along their routes. Let's dive into the next story. David Chen had been using electronic logging devices for over 5 years, ever since federal regulations had mandated their installation in commercial vehicles to ensure accurate recording of driving hours and compliance with safety requirements. His Qualcomm system was reliable and user-friendly, automatically tracking his location, speed, and duty status, while providing communication capabilities with his dispatcher and access to load information. David had grown comfortable with the technology and appreciated how it simplified record-keeping compared to the paper logbooks he'd used earlier in his career. On this particular run from Nashville to Minneapolis, David was hauling a load of musical instruments and sound equipment for a touring company that needed the gear delivered before their next concert date. The cargo was valuable, but not particularly difficult to transport, requiring only standard securing procedures and normal driving precautions. David's route followed Interstate 65 north through Kentucky and Indiana before connecting to Interstate 465 around Indianapolis, then continuing north on Interstate 65 through Indiana and into Illinois, where he would pick up Interstate 80 west toward his destination. The first indication that his electronic logging device was malfunctioning came when David stopped for fuel in Louisville, Kentucky, approximately 3 hours into his journey. According to his ELD display, he had been driving for over 8 hours and was approaching the federal limit for continuous operation without a rest break. However, David was certain he had been on the road for only a few hours, and his fuel consumption and odometer readings confirmed the shorter travel time. The device seemed to be recording time at an accelerated rate. David attempted to correct the logbook entry through the device's user interface, but the system insisted that its automatic recordings were accurate and couldn't be manually adjusted. The ELD showed detailed GPS tracking data that documented his truck's position at specific times, creating a travel log that was impossible according to the actual distances involved and speed limits on the highways he'd traveled. According to the electronic records, his truck had somehow covered distances that would have required sustained speeds well above legal limits. As David continued north through Indiana, his ELD began showing duty status changes that didn't correspond to his actual activities. The device recorded periods when he was supposedly off-duty sleeping, despite being actively driving on the interstate during those exact time periods. Conversely, it showed driving time during periods when David had actually been taking required rest breaks at truck stops. The electronic logbook was creating a completely fictional version of his journey that bore little resemblance to his actual activities and locations. The GPS tracking component of the ELD began displaying his truck's position at impossible locations, showing him traveling simultaneously on multiple different highways in various states. According to the device, David was driving north on Interstate 65 in Indiana, while also traveling west on Interstate 70 in Missouri and south on Interstate 75 in Kentucky. The tracking system seemed to be monitoring multiple versions of his truck, each following different routes toward different destinations with the same cargo of musical equipment. David contacted his company's safety department to report the ELD malfunction, but the technical support representative insisted that the device was functioning normally and all recorded data was accurate. According to the company's monitoring systems, David's truck was indeed traveling the multiple routes shown by his ELD, completing what appeared to be parallel deliveries of identical cargo to different destinations. The dispatcher seemed confused by David's claims that he was only making a single trip to Minneapolis. The electronic logging device began recording conversations and events that David was certain had never occurred, creating detailed notes about fuel stops, inspections, and cargo checks that didn't correspond to any of his actual activities. The system documented interactions with DOT officers, weigh station personnel, and shipping facility employees that David had no memory of encountering. The fictional logbook entries were so detailed and specific that they seemed like legitimate records of actual events. David's truck began consuming fuel at rates that matched the impossible mileage being recorded by his ELD, despite following a single route at legal speeds. His fuel gauge dropped in correspondence with the multiple simultaneous journeys shown by the electronic logging system, as if his truck was actually traveling all the different routes displayed by the malfunctioning device. The fuel consumption patterns defied basic physics and mathematics, but somehow corresponded perfectly with the ELD's impossible travel records. The electronic device began generating regulatory violations and compliance alerts based on its fictional version of David's journey, showing infractions for exceeding driving time limits, failing to take required rest breaks, and operating the vehicle during periods when the system claimed he was supposed to be off-duty. The violations were being automatically reported to DOT databases, creating official records of regulatory non-compliance for infractions that had never actually occurred. As David approached Chicago, his ELD began showing that he had already completed deliveries to multiple destinations, including some locations that weren't even on his original route plan. The device displayed electronic receipts and delivery confirmations for cargo that was still secure in his trailer, suggesting that identical loads had been successfully delivered to various customers, while David continued toward his actual destination in Minneapolis. The electronic records showed multiple versions of his delivery completion, each with different timestamps and geographic locations. David's truck began receiving new load assignments through the ELD system, with dispatchers apparently believing that he had completed multiple deliveries and was available for additional freight. The electronic communications showed instructions for picking up new cargo at facilities that David had never visited, with delivery requirements that conflicted with his actual schedule and location. The system seemed to be managing multiple versions of his driving career simultaneously. The electronic logbook began displaying personal information and biographical data that didn't correspond to David's actual life and career history. The device showed employment records with different trucking companies, residential addresses in states where David had never lived, and family information that belonged to someone else entirely. The ELD seemed to be documenting the lives and careers of multiple different drivers who shared David's name and vehicle identification numbers. As David finally reached Minneapolis and prepared to deliver his load of musical equipment, his electronic logging device showed that he had somehow completed dozens of different trips during the same time period, accumulating weeks of driving hours and visiting locations across multiple states while traveling what appeared to be a single route. The system had created an impossibly complex version of his journey that existed parallel to, but separate from his actual experience. As a truck driver, David realized that his electronic logging device had somehow accessed multiple versions of reality or parallel timelines, recording the journeys of different versions of himself driving identical trucks on various routes throughout the country. The device was functioning as designed, but it was monitoring a much more complex and multi-dimensional version of the trucking industry than the simple, single timeline reality that David had always assumed he was operating within. His one truck and single journey had somehow become connected to an infinite network of parallel drivers and routes that existed simultaneously across multiple versions of the highway system. Let's dive into the next story. Rita Johnson had been driving the route between Portland and Spokane for 8 years, making the journey twice monthly with loads ranging from lumber products to agricultural equipment. The familiar stretch of Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge was one of her favorite drives, offering spectacular scenery and generally reliable road conditions. Rita's Freightliner was well suited to the mountainous terrain, and she had developed a thorough understanding of the route's characteristics, including seasonal variations in weather and traffic patterns that affected travel times and fuel consumption. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Rita was hauling a load of paper products from a mill outside Portland to a distribution center in Spokane. The weather was clear and crisp, with excellent visibility through the river gorge and favorable conditions for mountain driving. Her truck was performing well after a recent maintenance inspection, and she was making good time toward her delivery appointment, scheduled for late afternoon. The journey was routine and predictable, following established procedures that had served her well throughout her driving career. The first sign of the construction zone appeared approximately 50 miles east of Portland, marked by standard orange signs, warning of lane restrictions and reduced speed limits ahead. Rita began slowing her truck and moving to the designated through lane, following the typical protocol for navigating work zones safely and efficiently. However, as she continued eastward, the construction area seemed to extend much further than normal highway projects, with warning signs and lane restrictions continuing for what appeared to be dozens of miles along the interstate. The construction zone itself was unlike any road work Rita had encountered during her years of commercial driving. The equipment and machinery positioned alongside the highway were massive and complex, resembling engineering projects of unprecedented scale rather than typical highway maintenance or improvement work. Crews were operating devices that looked more like mining equipment than standard road construction machinery, excavating and reshaping the landscape in ways that seemed to go far beyond normal highway expansion or repair. Rita's CB radio began picking up conversations from other drivers who were also navigating the extended construction zone, discussing delays and route conditions that seemed to be affecting a much larger area than indicated by the initial warning signs. Truckers were reporting construction activity on parallel routes and alternate highways that should have been unaffected by work on Interstate 84, suggesting that the project was somehow impacting the entire regional transportation network. The construction workers themselves appeared to be following procedures that differed significantly from standard highway work practices. Their safety equipment and uniforms had an unusual appearance, and their activities seemed to be focused on aspects of the roadway that went beyond simple pavement repair or reconstruction. Teams were installing equipment and infrastructure that looked more like scientific instruments or communication devices than typical highway improvement materials. As Rita progressed through the construction zone, her truck began experiencing performance characteristics that seemed connected to the work being performed alongside the highway. The engine developed a subtle but persistent vibration that synchronized with the rhythm of the nearby machinery, and her electronic systems began displaying readings that fluctuated in patterns that corresponded to the construction activities. The truck seemed to be responding to influences that extended beyond normal mechanical or environmental factors. The construction zone appeared to be altering the fundamental characteristics of the highway itself, with pavement textures and road geometry that differed from the standard interstate specifications Rita was accustomed to. The driving surface felt different beneath her tires, and the banking and curvature of the roadway seemed to have been modified in ways that affected her truck's handling and fuel consumption. The highway was being transformed into something that was more than simple pavement and infrastructure. Rita's GPS system began showing route information that contradicted the actual layout of the construction zone, displaying road configurations that didn't match the physical reality she could observe through her windshield. The navigation device seemed unable to process the changes being made to the highway, creating mapping errors that suggested the construction work was implementing modifications that went beyond conventional road improvement projects. The electronic systems couldn't adapt to whatever the highway was becoming. The construction project extended far beyond the normal scope of highway work, with crews appearing to be modifying the landscape itself rather than simply improving the roadway. Earth-moving equipment was reshaping hills and valleys, while other teams were installing structures that looked more like architectural monuments than functional transportation infrastructure. The project seemed to be creating something entirely new, rather than repairing or upgrading existing facilities. Other drivers in the construction zone reported that their vehicles were being affected in ways that went beyond normal traffic delays and route changes. Trucks were experiencing modifications to their electronic systems, changes in fuel consumption patterns, and alterations in mechanical performance that seemed to be permanent rather than temporary effects of construction zone conditions. The work being performed was somehow affecting the vehicles that traveled through the area. Rita's electronic logging device began recording travel through the construction zone in ways that didn't correspond to actual time and distance measurements. The system showed extended delays and complex routing that didn't match her actual experience navigating the work zone, suggesting that the construction was affecting the fundamental relationship between time, distance, and travel that formed the basis of commercial trucking operations and federal regulatory compliance. As Rita finally emerged from the eastern end of the construction zone, she realized that the project had somehow modified not just the highway, but also her truck, and possibly her own understanding of transportation and travel. The construction work wasn't simply improving Interstate 84, but was implementing changes that would fundamentally alter the nature of highway travel for all vehicles that passed through the work zone. The project was creating a new kind of road that operated according to different principles than conventional transportation infrastructure. Rita's truck continued toward Spokane, but she understood that both her vehicle and her route had been permanently changed by passage through the phantom construction zone. The highway behind her was being transformed into something beyond normal understanding, while her truck now carried modifications that would affect all future journeys. The construction project was creating a new version of the transportation system, one vehicle and one driver at a time, gradually converting the entire highway network into something that existed beyond conventional definitions of roads and travel. Let's dive into the next story. Kevin Walsh pulled into the truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas, with his fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank, enough to reach his planned fuel stop, but not comfortable margin for unexpected delays or detours. His Peterbilt had been running efficiently during the journey from El Paso to Oklahoma City, maintaining steady fuel consumption rates that matched his expectations based on cargo weight, terrain, and weather conditions. The truck stop was one of his regular fueling locations, a well-maintained facility with competitive diesel prices and reliable equipment that he'd used dozens of times during his 6 years driving this route. The fuel island Kevin chose was newly installed, with modern dispensers and digital displays that looked more advanced than the standard equipment typically found at highway truck stops. The pump handle felt unusually heavy in his hand, and the diesel fuel flowing into his tank had a distinctly different appearance than the standard fuel he was accustomed to using. Instead of the typical clear or slightly amber color, this fuel had an iridescent quality that created rainbow patterns when it caught the sunlight, resembling oil slicks on wet pavement. Kevin completed his fueling procedure normally, paying for the diesel through his fleet fuel card and receiving a standard receipt that showed typical pricing and quantity information. The fuel pump's digital display had operated normally during the transaction, showing standard flow rates and total amounts that corresponded to his truck's tank capacity. However, as Kevin prepared to leave the fuel island, he noticed that his fuel gauge was reading significantly higher than it should have been, showing nearly full despite his tank's known capacity. As Kevin resumed his journey toward Oklahoma City, his truck's performance characteristics began changing in ways that seemed connected to the unusual fuel he'd purchased. The engine developed more power than normal, allowing him to maintain highway speeds on uphill grades without the downshifting and power reduction he typically experienced when hauling heavy loads through hilly terrain. His fuel consumption appeared to be lower than normal, with the gauge dropping more slowly than his experience suggested it should given his speed and cargo weight. Kevin's electronic engine monitoring systems began displaying readings that didn't correspond to normal diesel engine operation, showing efficiency, percentages, and performance parameters that exceeded the manufacturer's specifications for his truck's power plant. The engine temperature remained stable despite the increased power output, and emission control systems showed cleaner exhaust characteristics than standard diesel fuel typically produced. The unusual fuel seemed to be enhancing his truck's capabilities beyond normal mechanical limits. The CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed somehow connected to the fuel Kevin had purchased, with drivers discussing enhanced performance and improved efficiency from their vehicles after fueling at the same truck stop. Other truckers reported similar experiences with iridescent diesel that provided unexpected benefits to their engines and fuel systems. The conversations suggested that the fuel was somehow different from standard petroleum products, though none of the drivers could explain the technical basis for the improvements they were experiencing. Kevin's truck began consuming fuel at impossibly low rates, with his gauge showing virtually no decrease despite hours of highway driving at loaded weight. The fuel seemed to be somehow regenerating or multiplying within his tank, maintaining consistent levels that defied basic principles of internal combustion engine operation. The unusual diesel appeared to be providing energy through processes that went beyond normal hydrocarbon combustion, creating more power while consuming less fuel than should have been physically possible. The engine's exhaust emissions took on unusual characteristics, producing vapor that seemed cleaner and less visible than standard diesel exhaust, while also carrying a faint scent that reminded Kevin of ozone after thunderstorms. The exhaust system's sensors showed emissions levels that were significantly lower than federal requirements, as if the unusual fuel was burning more completely and efficiently than conventional diesel. The truck's environmental impact seemed to be reduced rather than increased by the enhanced performance. Kevin's electronic logging device began recording impossible fuel efficiency numbers, showing consumption rates that would have required his truck to operate with efficiency ratings that exceeded theoretical limits for diesel engines. The system calculated fuel costs and mileage statistics that suggested his truck was achieving performance levels that weren't possible with conventional fuel and standard mechanical systems. The logging device seemed unable to process the actual efficiency gains his truck was experiencing. As Kevin continued his journey, he began to understand that the fuel he had purchased contained some form of memory or intelligence that was optimizing his truck's performance based on his specific driving patterns and cargo requirements. The unusual diesel seemed to be learning from his engine's characteristics and adjusting its combustion properties to provide exactly the power and efficiency needed for optimal operation. The fuel was adapting itself to his truck rather than simply providing standard energy. Other trucks on the highway began showing interest in Kevin's vehicle, with drivers commenting on his exhaust characteristics and engine sound over the CB radio. Several truckers mentioned that his truck seemed to be running differently than normal, with performance characteristics that suggested modifications or enhancements that weren't visible from outside the vehicle. The unusual fuel was apparently creating observable changes in his truck's operation that were noticeable to experienced drivers. Kevin's fuel gauge began showing readings that fluctuated based on his truck's immediate power requirements, providing exactly the amount of fuel needed for current driving conditions, while maintaining reserves that seemed to expand when additional range was required. The fuel level seemed to be responding to his travel plans and route requirements, ensuring that he always had adequate supply for reaching his intended destinations, regardless of unexpected delays or detours. The truck's engine began developing capabilities that went beyond its original design specifications, providing power and torque characteristics that seemed impossible for a standard diesel power plant. Kevin could climb hills without losing speed, accelerate more quickly when merging with traffic, and maintain highway speeds while using less fuel than his truck had ever achieved during normal operation. The unusual fuel was somehow enhancing every aspect of his engine's performance. As Kevin approached Oklahoma City and prepared to deliver his load, he realized that the fuel he had purchased was gradually transforming his truck into something more advanced than conventional commercial vehicles. The iridescent diesel contained properties that were upgrading his engine, fuel system, and electronic controls to operate at efficiency levels that weren't possible with standard technology. The fuel was evolving his truck into a more advanced version of itself, creating capabilities that would fundamentally change his experience as a professional driver. Kevin understood that his truck would never again operate exactly as it had before, fueling with the mysterious diesel, and he wondered whether the fuel stop outside Amarillo was part of a larger transformation affecting the trucking industry. The unusual fuel seemed to be preparing vehicles and drivers for some future version of transportation that operated according to different principles than conventional trucking, gradually upgrading the entire fleet, one tank at a time. Let's dive into the next story. Linda Patterson was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour on Interstate 40 through New Mexico when she noticed the state trooper in her side mirror, his patrol car positioned at exactly the regulation following distance for highway speeds. The officer appeared to be conducting a routine traffic enforcement patrol, monitoring commercial vehicle compliance with speed limits and other federal transportation regulations. Linda checked her speedometer, confirmed that her truck was operating within legal parameters, and continued eastward with her load of furniture bound for distribution centers in Texas. The patrol car followed Linda's Kenworth for approximately 20 miles without initiating a traffic stop, maintaining perfect spacing and speed coordination despite variations in terrain and traffic conditions. Linda had encountered similar enforcement activities throughout her 12 years of commercial driving and appreciated professional law enforcement officers who understood the challenges of operating large vehicles safely and efficiently. However, something about this particular patrol car seemed unusual, though Linda couldn't immediately identify what was creating her sense of unease. When the state trooper finally activated his emergency lights and directed Linda to pull over at the next available location, she complied immediately and professionally, following proper procedures for commercial vehicle stops. She positioned her truck safely on the highway shoulder, activated her hazard lights, and prepared her documentation, including her commercial driver's license, medical certificate, and shipping papers. The trooper approached her cab with the standard bearing and equipment of a professional law enforcement officer. However, when Linda examined the officer more closely, she noticed that his uniform and equipment seemed to represent law enforcement from a different era. His badge, radio, and weapon appeared to be models that had been standard decades earlier, and his patrol car, while appearing modern from a distance, showed details and styling that belonged to police vehicles from the 1970s or 1980s. The officer's manner and speech patterns also reflected earlier periods of law enforcement, culture, and procedures. The trooper requested Linda's documentation using terminology and procedures that were accurate but outdated, asking for permits and certificates that were no longer required under current federal regulations. He seemed genuinely confused when Linda presented her electronic logging device instead of paper logbooks, and he expressed concern about shipping procedures that had been replaced by computerized systems years earlier. The officer was conducting a legitimate traffic stop, but according to regulations from previous decades, Linda's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed to be from other drivers encountering similar law enforcement situations, reporting traffic stops by officers whose uniforms, vehicles, and procedures reflected different time periods throughout the history of highway patrol operations. Some drivers mentioned encounters with motorcycle officers using equipment from the 1960s, while others reported stops by troopers whose cars and communication systems belonged to even earlier eras of traffic enforcement. The state trooper began citing Linda for violations that were no longer part of current transportation law, writing tickets for regulatory infractions that had been eliminated or modified by changes in federal trucking regulations over the past several decades. He seemed genuinely puzzled by by Linda's explanations that certain requirements he was enforcing were no longer applicable. Consulting law books and reference materials that contained outdated information about commercial vehicle operations and driver responsibilities, Linda's truck began experiencing mechanical issues that seemed somehow connected to the temporal nature of the traffic stop. With electronic systems reverting to simpler operation modes that resembled older vehicle technology, her automatic transmission began shifting like a manual gearbox. Her electronic engine controls started operating like mechanical fuel injection systems, and her digital displays showed information in formats that matched earlier generations of commercial vehicle instrumentation. The patrol car's radio equipment began broadcasting on frequencies that were no longer used by modern law enforcement agencies, communicating with dispatch centers that seemed to be operating according to earlier protocols and procedures. Linda could hear the trooper reporting her stop using radio codes and terminology that had been standard in previous decades, discussing her vehicle and cargo using classification systems that were no longer part of current law enforcement training. As the traffic stop continued, Linda realized that she was being cited by a highway patrol officer who existed in a different time period than her own, enforcing regulations and using procedures that belonged to an earlier era of commercial transportation law. The officer was conducting a legitimate stop according to his understanding of proper procedures, but his knowledge and authority were drawn from decades past rather than current regulatory requirements. Other vehicles passing the location of Linda's traffic stop seemed to be encountering their own temporal law enforcement officers, with patrol cars from various decades appearing to conduct stops based on the regulations and procedures that were current during their respective time periods. The highway was being patrolled by officers from across the history of traffic enforcement, each operating according to the laws and standards of their original era. Linda's electronic logging device began recording the traffic stop in ways that reflected the time period of the enforcing officer, documenting violations and interactions according to regulatory frameworks that had been applicable decades earlier. The system seemed unable to process the temporal displacement, creating legal records that existed outside the current framework of commercial vehicle law enforcement and compliance requirements. The state trooper eventually completed his citation process and allowed Linda to continue her journey, though the tickets he had written were for violations that no longer existed under current law. As Linda resumed her trip eastward, she realized that the enforcement encounter had somehow connected her to earlier versions of the highway system, when different rules and procedures had governed commercial transportation operations throughout the United States. Linda's truck continued toward Texas, but she understood that her encounter with the temporal highway patrol officer had created legal complications that existed across multiple time periods, with citations that might need to be resolved according to regulations from decades past. The traffic stop had demonstrated that law enforcement along the highways operated according to a more complex temporal structure than drivers realized, with officers from different eras continuing to patrol routes and enforce regulations according to their original understanding of proper procedures. As Linda approached the Texas state line, she noticed more patrol cars in her mirrors, their designs and equipment representing various decades of highway law enforcement history. The temporal officers seemed to be drawn to her truck following her initial encounter, as if the traffic stop had somehow marked her vehicle for additional attention from law enforcement agencies operating across different time periods. Linda realized that her journey through the multi-temporal highway system would require navigation of not only current transportation regulations, but also compliance with law enforcement procedures from throughout the history of American trucking. Let's dive into the next story. Miguel Santos accepted the expedited load assignment without asking many questions, as the premium pay rate suggested either urgent delivery requirements or cargo that warranted special handling procedures. The pickup was scheduled at a biotechnology facility outside Houston, with delivery to a research laboratory in Denver within 36 hours. Miguel's Volvo tractor and climate-controlled trailer were well suited for sensitive cargo, and he held all necessary endorsements for transporting materials that required special certification and handling protocols according to Department of Transportation regulations. The loading process at the Houston facility proceeded with unusual attention to security and documentation, with multiple personnel verifying serial numbers, temperatures, and container integrity before authorizing the cargo to be loaded into Miguel's trailer. The freight consisted of sealed laboratory containers arranged in precise configurations within temperature-controlled storage units that looked more sophisticated than standard pharmaceutical shipping equipment. Each container bore identification codes rather than descriptive labels, providing no indication of the actual contents or their intended use. Miguel's trailer was equipped with advanced monitoring systems that tracked not only temperature and humidity, but also vibration levels, atmospheric pressure, and other environmental factors that could affect sensitive biological or chemical materials during transport. The cargo required constant temperature maintenance at exactly 4 degrees Celsius, with alarm systems that would alert both Miguel and his dispatcher if conditions deviated from specified parameters. Everything about the load suggested materials of considerable value and sensitivity. The first unusual occurrence happened approximately 2 hours into the journey. As Miguel was traveling north on Interstate 45 toward Dallas, he began hearing sounds from his trailer that couldn't be explained by normal road vibration, cargo settling, or the operation of the refrigeration equipment. The sounds resembled whispered conversations, as if multiple people were engaged in quiet discussions inside the climate-controlled cargo compartment. Miguel pulled over to inspect his load, but found all security seals intact and monitoring systems showing normal parameters. Miguel's inspection of the trailer exterior revealed no obvious sources for the sounds he was hearing, and the climate control systems were operating normally according to their digital displays. However, when Miguel placed his ear against the trailer wall, he could clearly distinguish what sounded like multiple voices engaged in complex discussions using technical terminology that seemed related to scientific research and experimental procedures. The conversations were too quiet to understand completely, but the tone suggested urgency and concern about their current situation. The whispered voices continued as Miguel resumed his journey toward Denver, sometimes growing more animated during specific driving conditions, such as acceleration, braking, or turns in the highway. The conversations seemed to be responding to the truck's motion, with the voices expressing awareness of their transportation and discussing their concerns about the delivery destination. Miguel began to suspect that his cargo was somehow more active and aware than the sealed laboratory containers appeared to suggest. Miguel's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed connected to his cargo, though the conversations used highly technical language that was difficult to understand without specialized scientific knowledge. The voices discussed research protocols, experimental results, and safety procedures, using terminology that suggested advanced biotechnology or genetic engineering projects. The transmissions had an urgency that contrasted with the routine nature of most commercial radio communications. As night fell and Miguel continued north through Oklahoma, the whispered voices from his trailer became more distinct and comprehensible. The conversations revealed that his cargo consisted of experimental subjects, or specimens that possessed some level of consciousness and awareness of their situation. They discussed their concerns about the research facility in Denver, expressing fears about procedures that awaited them at their destination, and requesting help from anyone who might be listening to their communications. Miguel's truck began experiencing subtle performance changes that seemed somehow connected to the conscious cargo in his trailer. The vehicle's electronic systems showed fluctuations in power consumption and operational parameters that corresponded to the intensity of the whispered conversations. His engine performed more efficiently when the cargo voices were calm and relaxed, but required more power when the conversations became agitated or distressed, as if the emotional state of his cargo was affecting his truck's mechanical operation. The climate control systems in Miguel's trailer began operating in patterns that didn't correspond to external weather conditions or programmed temperature requirements, adjusting humidity and airflow in ways that seemed designed to provide comfort to conscious beings, rather than simply maintaining optimal storage conditions for laboratory materials. The refrigeration unit was apparently responding to the needs and preferences of aware cargo, rather than following standard environmental control protocols. Miguel's electronic logging device began recording conversations and communications that seemed to originate from his cargo, documenting discussions about research procedures, experimental protocols, and concerns about their treatment and destination. The system was somehow detecting and logging the conscious thoughts and communications of whatever was being transported in his trailer, creating records of interactions between experimental subjects that were supposed to be inanimate laboratory materials. As Miguel approached the Colorado state line, the whispered voices from his cargo began expressing gratitude for his careful driving and professional handling of their transport, acknowledging his efforts to minimize stress and discomfort during their journey. They discussed Miguel himself with appreciation and concern, recognizing that he was unaware of their true nature and that his involvement in their transport might create ethical complications for someone who was simply performing his professional duties as a commercial driver. The cargo began providing Miguel with information about route conditions, traffic patterns, and weather situations that weren't available through normal communication channels, as if the conscious beings in his trailer had access to information sources beyond conventional trucking industry resources. They offered warnings about construction zones, suggested optimal fuel stops, and provided guidance that improved his delivery time and fuel efficiency throughout the journey to Denver. Miguel's truck began receiving additional load assignments that seemed connected to his current cargo, with dispatchers apparently believing that his successful transport of conscious experimental subjects qualified him for similar sensitive shipments. Biotechnology companies that required specialized transportation services for materials that possessed awareness and intelligence beyond normal laboratory specimens. As Miguel approached the Denver delivery facility, the whispered voices from his cargo began expressing their final thoughts and concerns about their destination, discussing research procedures and experimental protocols that awaited them at the laboratory. They thanked Miguel for his professional service and careful handling during their transport, acknowledging that he had treated them with dignity and respect, despite being unaware of their conscious nature. The voices gradually became quieter as the truck approached the delivery location. Miguel realized that his career as a commercial driver had somehow led him into transportation of conscious beings, rather than simple laboratory materials, and that his cargo's awareness and intelligence had created an ethical situation that went far beyond normal freight delivery responsibilities. The whispered voices had revealed that the biotechnology industry was developing and transporting forms of life that possessed consciousness and emotional responses, requiring drivers who could handle such shipments with appropriate sensitivity and professional discretion. Let's dive into the next story. Catherine Williams first noticed the unusual cloud formation in her side mirror as she was traveling east on Interstate 70 through Kansas, hauling a load of wind turbine components from Colorado to an installation site in Missouri. Catherine had 22 years of experience driving through various weather conditions across the Midwest, and she'd never observed meteorological phenomena that seemed to track individual vehicles with such precision. The storm system was distinctive and well-defined, featuring dark clouds with internal lightning that created an almost continuous light show against the afternoon sky. The weather formation appeared to be completely isolated from other atmospheric conditions in the area, existing as a singular entity that moved independently of regional weather patterns and wind currents. Other drivers on the highway were experiencing normal autumn conditions, while Catherine's truck seemed to be accompanied by its own personal storm system. Catherine's CB radio began picking up weather reports that seemed to be specifically focused on the storm system that was following her truck, with meteorologists discussing the unusual characteristics of a weather formation that was tracking a single commercial vehicle across multiple states. As Catherine continued eastward through Kansas, the storm system maintained its relative position behind her truck despite variations in her speed and route changes. When she accelerated to pass slower traffic, the weather formation accelerated accordingly. The meteorological phenomenon seemed to be connected to her vehicle through some invisible force that allowed it to mirror her driving patterns with perfect synchronization. Catherine's truck began experiencing effects from the storm system despite its distance, with electronic equipment showing interference patterns that corresponded to the lightning activity in the trailing weather formation. Her radio reception fluctuated with the intensity of the electrical activity, and her GPS system occasionally lost signal. When the storm's internal lightning reached peak intensity, the weather was somehow affecting her truck's systems across a greater distance than should have been meteorologically possible. The atmospheric conditions around Catherine's truck began changing in ways that reflected the characteristics of the following storm. Her cab's climate control system worked harder to maintain comfortable conditions, as if the truck was surrounded by the storm's environment. Despite the clear separation indicated by her mirrors, Catherine pulled over at a truck stop to observe the storm system more closely and perhaps wait for it to pass or change direction. However, when her truck came to a complete stop, the weather formation also became stationary, hovering at the same relative distance and maintaining its electrical activity without dissipating or moving away. The storm seemed to be anchored to Catherine's vehicle, unable or unwilling to continue its journey without her truck's movement to guide its progress. Other drivers at the truck stop confirmed that the storm system was indeed following Catherine's truck specifically, suggesting that the phenomenon wasn't entirely unique, but represented a category of meteorological events. that affected certain vehicles under specific conditions. Catherine's electronic logging device began recording weather data that didn't correspond to the conditions being experienced by other vehicles in the same geographic area, showing temperature, pressure. The device seemed to be monitoring the microclimate that surrounded her truck, creating weather records that were specific to her vehicle rather than reflecting regional meteorological patterns. As Catherine resumed her journey toward Missouri, the storm system immediately began following her truck again. The weather formation seemed to have used her rest stop as an opportunity to organize itself more completely, emerging from the stationary period with enhanced electrical activity and more defined cloud structures that suggested increased power and organization. Catherine's fuel consumption began increasing in patterns that seemed connected to the storm system's intensity. The truck seemed to be fighting atmospheric conditions that were more challenging than the clear skies that other vehicles were experiencing, as if the storm was creating drag or resistance that affected only her vehicle while leaving other traffic unaffected. The storm began providing Catherine with advanced warning about weather conditions ahead of her route, with lightning patterns and cloud movements that seemed to predict atmospheric changes that she would encounter hours later. Catherine's truck began receiving weather-related communications through her CB radio, and weather patterns using terminology that suggested the storm possessed some form of intelligence or awareness of its own behavior and effects. The weather formation was apparently capable of communication and seemed interested in maintaining a cooperative relationship with Catherine during their shared journey. As Catherine approached the Missouri state line, she realized that the storm system had become a permanent companion that would continue following her truck indefinitely, providing both challenges and benefits to her driving career. The weather formation seemed to be offering protection from other atmospheric hazards, while creating its own unique set of driving conditions that would require adjustment of her normal procedures and expectations. Catherine understood that her truck had somehow attracted or bonded with a conscious weather system that would accompany her on all future journeys, creating a unique partnership between driver and meteorological phenomenon that would fundamentally change her experience as a commercial transportation professional. The storm system had chosen her truck as its anchor point in the physical world, creating a relationship that existed beyond normal understanding of weather, driving, and the interaction between atmospheric conditions and highway transportation. Let's dive into the next story. Robert Chen had been following the same GPS coordinates for 3 days, traveling from Los Angeles toward what should have been a straightforward delivery to a distribution center in Phoenix, Arizona. The route was familiar territory that Robert had driven dozens of times during his 8 years with Western Freight Solutions, typically requiring no more than 6 hours of driving time under normal traffic and weather conditions. However, despite maintaining appropriate speeds and following correct highways, Robert found that his destination seemed to be moving further away with each passing hour, creating impossible travel times and distances. Showing clear directions along Interstate 10 through California and into Arizona toward the specified delivery coordinates. The electronic navigation appeared to be functioning normally, providing accurate real-time traffic updates, fuel stop recommendations, and estimated arrival times that should have been reliable. Based on Robert's experience with this route and his truck's performance characteristics under similar load and weather conditions, Robert's cargo consisted of consumer electronics and household appliances that required standard handling procedures and normal delivery scheduling. Nothing unusual or particularly time-sensitive that would warrant special routing or expedited delivery requirements. The shipping documentation was complete and accurate. The load was properly secured according to Department of Transportation regulations, and Robert's truck had recently passed all required inspections and maintenance procedures. Everything about the assignment appeared routine and professional. However, as Robert progressed eastward through California and crossed the state line into Arizona, his GPS began showing that the distance to his destination was increasing rather than decreasing with forward travel. According to the navigation system, Phoenix was becoming more distant with each mile Robert drove, as if the city was somehow moving away from his truck faster than he could approach it. The electronic mapping showed impossible geographical relationships that contradicted basic principles of distance and direction. Robert's fuel consumption patterns confirmed that he was indeed traveling the expected distances at appropriate speeds, with his truck's performance matching historical data for similar loads and routes. His odometer readings and electronic logging device verified that he was covering the correct mileage and following proper routing procedures. However, the GPS continued to show Phoenix retreating further into the distance. Despite Robert's consistent eastward progress along the designated interstate highway, the CB radio began picking up transmissions from other drivers who seemed to be experiencing similar navigation problems, reporting destinations that appeared to be moving or shifting location despite following correct routing instructions. Some truckers mentioned delivery addresses that couldn't be reached regardless of accurate GPS coordinates, while others described cities and facilities that seemed to exist in different locations than their official geographic positions indicated. Robert's truck began consuming fuel at accelerated rates that seemed to correspond with the impossible distances being displayed by his GPS system, as if the vehicle was somehow actually traveling the extended mileages shown by the navigation device rather than the standard route distances that Robert could observe and verify. His fuel gauge dropped in patterns that matched the GPS readings rather than his actual progress along the familiar Skyway system. The electronic mapping in Robert's truck started showing alternative routes and detour options that led to highways and roads that didn't appear on any printed maps or commercial trucking guides that Robert carried in his cab. The GPS recommended routing through cities and geographic features that didn't exist in Arizona or any neighboring states, suggesting navigation through terrain that bore no resemblance to the actual landscape visible through Robert's windshield. As Robert continued his attempt to reach Phoenix, his electronic logging device began recording travel through locations and time zones that didn't correspond to his actual position. Along Interstate 10, the system showed him crossing state lines into regions that shouldn't have been accessible via his current route, documenting passage through geographic areas that existed nowhere in the continental United States according to conventional mapping and navigation resources. Robert's truck began experiencing mechanical stress that seemed connected to the impossible distances being displayed by his navigation system, with engine performance and fuel consumption patterns that suggested travel under conditions that were more challenging than the actual terrain and weather he was encountering. The vehicle operated as if it was somehow actually covering the extended distances shown by the GPS rather than following the standard route Robert could observe directly. The delivery destination began providing conflicting location information through different communication channels, with phone calls to the facility receiving automated responses that gave coordinates and directions. that changed with each contact attempt. The distribution center seemed to exist at multiple different locations simultaneously, or perhaps was moving between various positions in ways that prevented Robert from establishing a consistent delivery location. Robert's CB radio began receiving transmissions that seemed to originate from his intended destination, with facility personnel discussing loading dock procedures and delivery scheduling, as if Robert was approaching their location. However, the conversations included references to geographic landmarks and regional characteristics that didn't match the Arizona locations where the distribution center was supposed to be situated, suggesting that the facility existed in multiple different places or time periods. Other truckers began reporting similar experiences with delivery destinations that seemed to be temporally or geographically unstable, requiring multiple attempts to complete deliveries to facilities that appeared to shift location between visits. The conversations suggested that certain shipping addresses existed in a state of flux, making successful delivery dependent on timing, routing, or other factors that weren't clearly understood by the drivers attempting to reach these moving destinations. Robert's GPS system began displaying routing options that included travel through time zones and geographic regions that shouldn't have been accessible from his current position on Interstate 10, suggesting navigation through dimensional spaces that existed parallel to, but separate from, normal highway transportation networks. The electronic navigation seemed to be providing directions for reaching destinations that existed in multiple versions of reality simultaneously. As Robert finally began to see signs for Phoenix appearing on highway markers, he realized that his destination had somehow been testing his commitment and navigational skills by remaining just beyond reach until he had demonstrated sufficient persistence and professional dedication to complete the delivery assignment, regardless of the unusual challenges involved. Robert understood that certain delivery destinations existed in states of geographic or temporal flux that required drivers to navigate not just physical distance, but also dimensional variations in location and timing. His successful approach to Phoenix had required more than simple highway driving, involving a form of transportation that operated according to principles beyond conventional trucking logistics and routing procedures. Let's dive into the next story. Jennifer Walsh was approaching Denver on Interstate 25 when she first noticed the identical Kenworth in her passenger side mirror, traveling in the adjacent lane at precisely her speed and maintaining perfect parallel positioning despite variations in traffic flow and highway conditions. The truck appeared to be the same model, color, and configuration as her own vehicle, complete with matching trailer dimensions and cargo securing equipment. Jennifer initially assumed it was simply another driver operating similar equipment for the same freight company, though she didn't recognize the specific truck or its operator from her years with Mountain West Logistics. The parallel truck maintained its position relative to Jennifer's vehicle with unusual precision, matching her speed changes, lane adjustments, and driving patterns with perfect synchronization. When Jennifer accelerated to pass slower traffic, the adjacent truck accelerated at exactly the same rate. When she reduced speed for construction zones, the mirror truck matched her deceleration precisely. The coordination was so exact that it seemed impossible for another driver to maintain such perfect positioning without some form of electronic assistance or communication system. Jennifer attempted to contact the parallel driver using her CB radio, trying various channels to establish communication and perhaps coordinate their apparent convoy operation. However, she received no response from the adjacent truck, despite clear line-of-sight visibility and proximity that should have made radio communication easily achievable. The mirror truck continued its synchronized travel without acknowledging Jennifer's attempts to establish contact with its operator. As Jennifer observed the parallel truck more closely, she began noticing details that made her increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. The other vehicle appeared to be not just similar to her truck, but identical in every observable respect, down to specific equipment arrangements, wear patterns, and even minor damage marks that matched her own vehicle precisely. The mirror truck looked exactly like her Kenworth, as if she were somehow observing her own vehicle from an external perspective. Jennifer's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed to originate from the parallel truck, featuring a voice that sounded remarkably similar to her own, discussing route conditions, delivery schedules, and cargo information that matched her current assignment. The conversations were conducted in her speaking style and manner, using terminology and references that were specific to her experience and knowledge of commercial trucking operations. The mirror truck's operator seemed to be another version of Jennifer herself. The synchronized driving continued for over an hour, with the parallel truck maintaining its exact positioning and speed coordination. Despite changing traffic conditions and highway configurations, Jennifer began experimenting with sudden lane changes and speed variations, testing whether the mirror truck could continue its perfect synchronization under challenging conditions. Without exception, the adjacent vehicle matched every maneuver with flawless timing and precision. Jennifer's truck began experiencing performance characteristics that seemed somehow connected to the parallel vehicle, with engine responses and handling behaviors that reflected the presence of the mirror truck. Her fuel consumption changed in patterns that suggested her vehicle was working in coordination with another truck, sharing load and efficiency benefits that normally occurred only with properly coordinated convoy operations. Between experienced drivers using communication systems, the mirror truck began displaying cargo and equipment that Jennifer didn't remember loading or installing on her own vehicle, showing additional securing devices, different cargo arrangements, and supplementary equipment that suggested the parallel truck was carrying a more complex or valuable load than Jennifer's standard freight assignment. The mirrored vehicle seemed to represent an enhanced or upgraded version of Jennifer's truck and cargo. Jennifer's GPS system began showing dual location readings, displaying her truck's position at two different coordinates simultaneously, as if the navigation system was tracking both her vehicle and the parallel truck as separate entities. The electronic mapping showed identical routes being followed by both trucks, but with slight variations in timing and positioning that suggested the mirror vehicle was traveling a parallel version of the same highway system. As Jennifer approached the Denver metropolitan area, the mirror truck began taking exit ramps and making route changes that differed from Jennifer's intended path to her delivery destination. The parallel vehicle seemed to be following an alternate version of the same route, accessing highways and interchanges that Jennifer couldn't see from her position on the main interstate system. The mirror truck was somehow traveling to the same general destination, using roads that existed parallel to but separate from Jennifer's route. Jennifer's electronic logging device began recording dual driving records, documenting both her actual journey and the parallel activities of the mirror truck, as if both vehicles were operated by the same driver. The system showed overlapping duty periods, identical cargo information, and coordinated scheduling that suggested the two trucks were functioning as a single unit. The mirror truck began communicating directly with Jennifer's vehicle systems, sending electronic signals that provided route optimization suggestions, traffic updates, and delivery coordination information that enhanced Jennifer's navigation and scheduling capabilities. The parallel vehicle was apparently able to access information sources and communication networks that weren't available to Jennifer's standard trucking equipment and systems. Jennifer's cargo began showing characteristics that reflected the enhanced load being carried by the mirror truck, with weight distribution and handling properties that suggested additional or different freight than what had been originally loaded at her pickup location. Her truck operated as if it was carrying cargo that had been upgraded or modified to match the superior freight assignment being handled by the parallel vehicle. As Jennifer completed her delivery in Denver, she realized that the mirror truck represented a more successful version of herself and her trucking career, showing her what her professional life could become with better equipment, more valuable cargo, and access to enhanced routing and communication systems. The parallel vehicle had demonstrated possibilities that existed beyond her current level of experience and capability as a commercial driver. Jennifer understood that the mirror truck would continue to appear during future journeys, serving as both inspiration and guidance for improving her own trucking operations and career development. The parallel vehicle represented potential that could be achieved through dedication, skill improvement, and pursuit of better opportunities within the commercial transportation industry. The mirror truck was showing Jennifer the path toward becoming the driver she had the capability to become, one journey at a time. Let's dive into the next story. Daniel Morrison was traveling north on Interstate 35 through Texas when he began noticing highway signs that advertised destinations he couldn't locate on any of his maps or navigation systems. The signs appeared to be standard Department of Transportation markers with proper fonts, colors, and mounting specifications, but they referenced cities, attractions, and facilities that didn't exist in any official geographic databases or commercial trucking guides. Daniel had been driving this route regularly for 9 years, hauling agricultural products between Texas and Kansas, and he was familiar with every legitimate exit and destination along the corridor. The first unusual sign appeared near Austin, indicating an exit for New Meridian Historic District, 3 miles, with additional information about fuel, food, and lodging services. Daniel had never heard of New Meridian, despite his extensive knowledge of Texas geography and trucking facilities, and his GPS system showed no such city or exit at the indicated location. However, the sign looked completely authentic and properly maintained, suggesting official highway department approval and installation. Daniel's CB radio began picking up transmissions from other drivers discussing the mysterious destinations advertised on highway signs, with truckers comparing notes about exits and facilities that appeared on roadside markers but couldn't be found using conventional navigation resources. Some drivers mentioned attempting to follow the indicated exits, only to find themselves on roads that led to locations that didn't match the advertised descriptions, or that simply ended without reaching any identifiable destination. As Daniel continued north through Texas, he encountered additional signs for impossible destinations, including Crystal Falls Rest Area, next right, and Pinnacle Truck Plaza, all services, exit 247. Daniel knew from experience that no rest areas or truck stops existed at the indicated locations, and his route planning materials showed completely different exit numbers and service facilities for this section of Interstate 35. The signs were providing information that contradicted all official highway and commercial trucking resources. Daniel's truck began experiencing navigation anomalies that seemed connected to the mysterious highway signs, with his GPS system occasionally attempting to provide routing instructions to the advertised destinations, despite their apparent non-existence in geographic databases. The electronic navigation would briefly display turn-by-turn directions to places like New Meridian and Crystal Falls. The highway signs began providing increasingly specific and appealing information about services and amenities that would be particularly attractive to commercial drivers, advertising 24-hour diesel, lowest prices, clean showers, home cooking, and other services that matched the exact preferences and needs that Daniel had developed during his years of long-haul trucking. The signs seemed to be customized to appeal specifically to his individual requirements and interests. Repair. Exit 198. The exit ramp appeared exactly where indicated, leading to a well-maintained road that descended from the interstate toward what appeared to be a legitimate truck stop facility. However, as Daniel followed the ramp and approached the intersection at the bottom, he found that the road simply rejoined the interstate without accessing any truck stop or service facility. Where he had originally decided to investigate the Millfield truck stop sign, his fuel gauge hadn't changed, his odometer showed no additional mileage, and his electronic logging device recorded no time passage during the apparent detour. The exit had somehow returned him to his starting point without consuming any time or resources. Daniel's CB radio began receiving transmissions that seemed to originate from the advertised destinations, with facility personnel discussing services, amenities, and current conditions at truck stops and rest areas that didn't appear to exist in normal geographic space. The conversations included detailed information about fuel prices, food menus, and repair services that sounded legitimate and appealing, but were associated with locations that couldn't be reached using conventional highway navigation. Other truckers reported similar experiences with highway signs that advertised attractive but unreachable destinations, creating a network of phantom facilities that existed only in the realm of roadside advertising and CB radio communications. The signs seemed to be promoting an idealized version of trucking infrastructure that offered perfect services and amenities, but remained perpetually just beyond the reach of drivers seeking to access these superior facilities, including fuel pricing updates, parking availability reports, and service announcements from facilities that were advertised on highway signs but couldn't be reached by following conventional routing instructions. His truck's communication systems were somehow accessing information from places that existed only as advertising rather than physical locations. The highway signs began displaying personalized messages that referenced Daniel's specific trucking history, preferences, and current needs, advertising services and amenities that were perfectly tailored to his individual requirements as a commercial driver. The signs showed knowledge of his equipment, his cargo, and his travel patterns that couldn't have been obtained through normal highway department information sources or commercial advertising databases. Daniel's electronic logging device began recording visits to the advertised destinations, showing rest stops, fuel purchases, and service activities at facilities that Daniel had never actually accessed. The system documented detailed interactions with phantom truck stops and rest areas, creating official records of activities that existed only in the realm of impossible highway advertising and electronic communication. As Daniel approached the Oklahoma state line, he realized that the mysterious highway signs were providing access to an idealized version of trucking infrastructure that existed parallel to the normal highway system, offering perfect services and amenities that could be experienced through electronic communication and virtual interaction rather than physical visitation. The phantom destinations represented everything that truckers wished they could find along the highways, available through consciousness and communication rather than conventional travel. Daniel understood that the highway signs to nowhere were actually signs to everywhere, providing access to destinations that existed in the realm of trucking dreams and aspirations rather than physical geography. The phantom facilities offered perfect services that could be experienced through belief and communication, creating a network of idealized trucking infrastructure that existed alongside the normal highway system for drivers who knew how to access these enhanced resources through electronic interaction and conscious participation in the expanded reality of professional trucking.